Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the special public meeting for the Cincinnati Public School Board for October the 14th. Ms. Wagner, would you call the roll, please?
Ms. Bolton?
Present.
Mr. Craig?
Here.
Ms. Jones?
Here.
Dr. Moffitt?
Here.
Mr. Morosky?
Here.
Mrs. Weinberg? President Lindy?
Here. We have a important agenda this morning. We'll call everyone's attention briefly to our goals and guardrails, which are listed there in item B. You'll see our 5 student outcome goals, and you'll see our 6 guardrails reflecting the values of our community. And we have 2 items today for our board work session. We're going to get started right away on the first, which is the start of the FY25 budget process.
Thank you, President Lindy. Good morning, everyone. So to start today, we shared the documents in advance, and they are on board docs as well. And so before we go into the presentation portion, I would like to call our attention to the document that reads, and Rob, if you'll put it up on the screen, General Fund Budget History. It's the large piece of paper that was printed out for you. I wanted to start with this particular document because there was a question, and there have been a few different questions about how we were spending funds prior to COVID. So if you will look at this particular document, it takes you to our pre-COVID budget, and that would have been in school years 18-19 and 19-20, because if you, and I know all of us recall, but COVID hit March of 2020. So we started to receive ESSER funds after that school year, which gets us now to ESSER 3. If you will go to the last column before comments, that column, actually, I'm sorry, the column that says difference from FY19, and then there's a percent change if there's an actual percentage there. But if you look at the column that says difference from FY19, for the way that the BUD units are structured now, that gives you the difference from where we were in the 18-19 budget to where we are right now for the same item or a very similar item in our FY24 budget. So just wanted to start with that. I thank the Treasurer's team for putting this document together in this way, because I do think that it answers some of the questions about what did we do before ESSER and where we've had our greatest challenges. A couple of areas to call our attention to on this document, and then we'll go into the presentation. But there are a few areas that from FY19 to now that have severely blossomed, that we do want to make sure that we take a deeper look at. The first of those is on line 76. So if you go to, it says it's budget unit 76 under Department of Student Services. That's one that you will see in the presentation as well. So it starts it starts under the second set of blue, you see the second set of blue headings. The first department that you see is Department of Student Services. Is everyone with me? Yes. Okay. So right under there, for the row that shows BUD Unit 76, it says Student Services. And you're able to go through the years to see where the increases were. But from FY19 to now, there's been an increase of $31 million just in that particular org unit. The second to call your attention to that has the same kind of increase is under Operations, and that's the second set of rows down under Facilities Management. That's row BUD Unit 56. And the increase there has been $34 million. Some of that does take into account the work that we had to do with ESSER, that we did with ESSER around facilities, the new buildings, the expansions that we had to do, but to call the attention to that one as well. So just wanted to start here because I think it does give the beginning of the picture for where we were, where we started at the very beginning and where we are now. If you will turn over to the back of the document, at the very bottom, there is a summary. And the summary takes the major departments and puts them together and gives the amount change or the difference in the change from FY19 to now. And overall, we see at the very bottom, in terms of where we were 19 and where we are now, there is a difference of $86 million. So questions about this document before we go into the presentation?
Questions from board members? Ms. Bolton and Dr. Moffitt.
Thank you so much for this sheet, and thank you, that it's nice and big. I appreciate that. Always a hard copy, but big hard copy. Yes, I have to look into speaking to the mic. Just since we just turned over the page, the percent change, the last column on the second side, that was the change over the whole period that we're studying, meaning pre-COVID back to FY19.
That's the percent change from FY19 to FY24. Okay, so the ultimate change.
Thank you.
Dr. Moffitt.
Yeah, I just have a question. Under the line item 24, now we're on the first page, I'm sorry. So chief of schools, former deputy superintendent, is that, can you explain that?
Yeah, so the deputy superintendent, that's what the budget name used to be when Laura was the deputy superintendent. And then as superintendents have changed, it changed to the chief of schools. The difference between the big drop, the $2 million versus what it is now, was the DSL started out under that budget and then they ended up in their own budget unit.
So where are, okay, so I see from the, on 50.
They're in 52.
Thank you.
Other questions? Could you say, oh, sorry, Jen, go ahead.
I was just going to make a point that the, to answer the question about the difference in the percent, what I did is I combined the general fund and ESSER because we shifted a bunch of stuff in ESSER. So in order, if we only looked at general fund and general fund, it would not be apples to apples. So I wanted to make sure everybody understood that's a combined change, dollar value and percent. And the where there's a hashtag div is just because there was, that budget didn't exist. So it comes out as, you can't divide by 0.
But it is the difference in the change from FY19 to FY24.
Yes.
Mr. Craig?
And then for our total dollar amount, FY19 included, did it include the pass-through dollars as well?
19 did, yes.
So I mean,
So even though the budget stayed flat, the pass-through $100 million worth of tuition is not part of our budget anymore. So our expenses have grown to replace that tuition. Good point.
Superintendent, I had one question. You flagged in the difference from FY19 column, the 2 rows, one on student services and one on facilities. I was following what the facilities changes were that drove that increase. Can you say just one more time what the student services changes were that drove the increase?
Yeah, so I'll say that that's an area that we're really digging into. The one thing that we see that's the largest difference, and I'll ask the treasurer to share the same, is the one thing that we see as the largest difference is the change in the need for services. So there has been a huge increase in the population of students at this point that are receiving special education services, and the way that we're providing those services. So what you'll see in the presentation that we'll talk about today is that's one of the areas for us to continue to do some deeper study around, because we're spending a lot in that space, and we want to make sure that there is not a way for us to reorganize and reshuffle some of that funding.
And so a high-level analysis or review indicates that our percent of students with disabilities hasn't changed overall, but the mix of the disability has. In fact, we've had a huge growth in autism units, which are the smallest class sizes we have. It has a teacher and 2 pairs in it. So it's also the most costly classroom to run. So I just wrote myself a note to develop a trend to kind of explain that, what I know kind of anecdotally, but there's been a huge increase in the one-on-one paras in the budget over the years. There's been an increase in the managers in the Department of Special Ed to absorb these differences in disabilities. And that's all I can think of at the moment, but.
And
That's great, thank you.
And one of the things to also share there, and we will again, as we get into our budget review planning conversation, for example, right now we offer in our autism units, and we know that I think we increased by about 14 this year. but we offer in the units a teacher and a teacher and 2 paras. The state requirement is a teacher and 1 para. And so when we begin to think through the different areas for what we're providing for service delivery models, all of those things become things for us to have conversation about.
This also reflects an increase in English language learners and the support services that are required for them. Yeah, they're reflective in that budget.
Thank you.
And what is district-wide under other on the back page?
Good question. So that reflects the debt transfer. It reflects all the fees that the county auditor charges us to collect our property fees. It's bank fees, anything that you would consider like a fixed fee goes into that. The Fund 34 transfers in there, the $3.2 million that we have to put into the facility maintenance fund every year, it's in there.
Ms. Bolden.
Just to help me out, in follow up to what Member Craig asked regarding the pass-through, and that, thank you for that question. Help me out with the impact that has.
So the pass-through funding, they would give us the state share of the students in charter schools and vouchers and the other scholarships, Peterson and autism students. So we would get their state share revenue, and then they would turn around and deduct it off as an expense. So that's why they call it a pass-through. So it just passes through our bank account temporarily. But you'll see that our revenues have dropped because of that. We no longer receive those revenues. They pay them directly now. But we also don't have that tuition expense.
Gotcha. So just how does that impact the percentage in the last column, or does it?
So in the tuition budget, that's the last section on the front page under school and student support, you see tuition is number 5.
Right.
It was 109 million, and it's down to 6.5. The 6.5 still reflects open enrollment between districts tuition and some court-placed tuition-related costs.
But it would not have any impact, that pass-through issue doesn't have any other impact on any of the other line items that are listed here?
No.
Only that one? Okay,
Yep.
Thank you.
Any others? Okay, thank you.
Okay, so at this point, we will transition into our budget review planning information. The one thing that we'll ask as we go through the information, if we can jot questions as we go, we'll stop midway through the different slides so that we're able to, I'm sorry? No, just make sure you have the right link. Okay, thank you. We will stop as we go so that we can answer some of the questions that we have. But at the very end, it gives us opportunity to really begin to dig into the conversations and the recommendations that we have as a board. So we'll start with the first. All right, we'll start with the first slide with our treasury review of the budget discussion.
So this is a graphical picture of, let's see if I can do this. See that far? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So this is a graphical depiction of the change, basically what what you've just looked at in the 5-year in that longer history that shows from 613 at 613 million, and so that was a pre-COVID year, and then the COVID year. I'm sorry, that was last year, 613 million, and then what was recommended at 608 for the general fund budget, that included 20 million in the increase of the state funding revenue based on the new budget, biennium budget, and $20 million in COLA. So then, if you recall, the night on September 13th, when we were adopting the budget, we increased it due to the conversation around the preschool promise. So we increased it by that the cost that I had removed because I thought it was outside the master agreement, and on the floor we revised it. So we're at 609.9. Follow me? Okay. If you compare and you add on the ESSER budget is 112 million, but 86 million has been identified as recurring costs. So that's kind of the challenge at this point. If you remember my cliff, I almost inserted my cliff picture here. So if you combine those together, the holistic budget that we're trying to address is $696 million. If we do nothing, that budget's going to go up simply because of negotiated step increases by like $6 million. And so when we went and looked, and Kevin's working on the forecast now, we'll be presenting it and finance it for the first time on Friday, because we have to have it approved by the board in November. You only have one board meeting in November. Right now we're estimating that next year's revenue will be about $607 million. And that's very tentative. We'll go into the, I think it's in the next slide that shows the enrollment. But so any changes in enrollment are really reflected in the next year rather than later down the line than the old way it used to do. So this is dependent on us either growing or maintaining the enrollment that we have, not losing any. So the orange block there represents the estimated increase to fiscal year 24 that was reflective of the new state funding formula. So if you recall, they updated the base cost values to 2020. They were using 18, so they updated it to 20, so that immediately bumped up our revenue. And then the phase-in percent has increased over time as well, so that helped. So keeping in mind our agreement to not outspend our revenues because our cash balance is declining. We used to have some pretty nice reserves, and we started the last year at $100 million in cash, and we ended at $69 million in cash. Right now we're sitting at 112. I looked at last night. We have 112 million, but we also have 85 million in encumbrances. So we can no longer afford to create a budget that goes beyond our estimated revenues. Next slide. So this shows the enrollment I was talking about. So the formula looks at either the highest of either your last year's enrollment or the 3-year average. And we're on the 3-year average. And what's concerning is the average is declining because we haven't quite cleared the COVID drop yet. Overall, our enrollment is very close, but it's because preschool is higher than we'd anticipated, it ever has been. And but the state funding formula only funds K-12 plus preschool disability students. So if we look at it right now, fiscal year 23, our K-12 is at 33,261. I'm sorry, that's what I keep getting my years confused. 23 is 33,261. That was last year. This year, as of October 3rd or 4th, I took the extract at 33,034, and that's if every child gets funded. So remember, we get funded on ADM, which is a proportionalized funding. So, but as you can see, our K-12 hasn't quite recovered yet. We talked about a huge effort to get our enrollment returned to normal to maintain our revenues. So, any questions? Ms. Bolton?
You say that number again, the 600 and something projected revenue?
607.2.
I got it right. Thank you.
Treasurer, my mental math is just not that great. If we were to go back to where we were before COVID, what percent enrollment are we down?
Off the top of my head, I don't know. I have to calculate.
Last year.
Maybe less 10%.
It looks like it's down about 1,500 kids. Is that sort of right?
Yep.
It's 1,500.
1,700.
1,700 out of 35,000.
34,793. Remember, this is just K-12.
Yeah.
Okay, it's a 5% decrease.
Okay, that's helpful. That's a lot more than I thought it was. Yeah. Ms.
Well,
Jones?
we projected to regrow because
Yeah.
we had started regrowing from here.
Yeah.
And you know, like I said, our preschool numbers are up. So in total, we're looking fairly similar, but it's the K-12 that hasn't quite rebounded yet.
Yeah. Ms. Jones?
So I think I heard you say that some of that decline in growth was due to the COVID drop, right? But I mean, I'm assuming that those kids are somewhere. So we don't know whether or not they're leaving the district to go to charters or other Catholic schools. We don't have that information.
I don't know that we know specifically, holistically for the 1,700 from the beginning until now. You know, and in that this is also not disaggregated by grade levels or any of that information. The other thing that's also relevant is this is a snapshot of through about October 3rd or 4th. And the other numbers were overall enrollment numbers for us after the period of FTE, after count and all of that. And so there may be some changes there as well. The other thing that we don't know for this year is the impact of the universal vouchers. Because we're not completely clear at this point on how that's impacting us overall. We believe that there is some level of impact, but right now we wouldn't know that for sure.
Okay. Yeah, I'm glad you made that point because that's the other thing. I didn't think about that. But what is the impact of the vouchers? Okay.
We're in such a smaller, more intimate space today with zero audience. Are people okay with just first names and people just talk when they want to?
Only if I would be referred to as Queen.
Maven.
That's excellent.
Maven. Okay. Yes. By all means, please.
The Queen. Right?
Yeah, well, there's plenty of things I've been referred to. Okay, I have, this enrollment piece is important to me because I do really believe in growth. And I think we were sailing when we were growing, and I know it does impact, doesn't help us, as Jen points out all the time, doesn't help us necessarily at each particular place because it isn't growing where we may need it the most. But the aggregate, the overall enrollment does have an impact on the monies that we receive today. And you said we're a year behind. So have we figured out that we're going to get less money because of our lower? Could you speak to that? Because that's going to impact our revenue for this coming year as well. So
the May forecast to the November forecast, the average enrollment dropped by about 510 students, the 3-year average. 511. Okay, well, it was 510 point something, so they rounded up 511. That base cost on the formula would be $1.7 million loss in revenue. And then when I estimate this 33,000, that's another $1 million if that comes to fruition. And that's just the base. That's not the categorical add-ons, right? So it could be deeper than that.
Just to follow up on that, and I liked the superintendent mentioned this hasn't been disaggregated. I'm looking at the enrollment numbers, and because we've been looking at it for capacity in buildings and whatever, particularly in ad hoc. I'm very, very concerned with the post-COVID, the results of COVID, where we lost a significant number of families. And many of the families that we lost are not necessarily the families that every urban district across the country lost, and we can't find those kids. I mean, that's happening everywhere. But that we lost, I think, a significant number of the families that we might actually class as middle-class families. And it might be interesting to be able, as we disaggregate it, to see where they went. I mean, they had the opportunity to go to pay for tuition someplace else, or go private, or go Catholic school, where their kids might have been admitted more willingly than maybe some of our other kids that may have not been able, they may have been turned away from some of those other options. So, and that does have an impact too on then our report card, not just school by school, but by our aggregate capacity to deliver as well. So I think it'd be great to have some of that disaggregation that the superintendent mentioned. Would be helpful to me at any rate, because I remember kind of a scary number out of ad hoc several months ago, and it was the decline at, I think it was decline at Walnut was very, very sharp. And that impacts us greatly. Thank you.
It's kind of tying along to that same line of thinking there. I feel like I remember seeing something around that there was this drop at the 4 through 6, and then a kind of a rebound slightly, but not quite up to the K3 level when we got up to the high school age. And I think that may also speak to what we have to think about involved in services, right? So we have a bunch of services for our students who are K through 3 that also might be some of our smaller classes, that also may involve more of our resources involved to do that. If they then leave at that 4th grade level, or if we see some big decline at that point, that may also tell us that this is an area where we may have to pay special attention to keep those enrollment numbers up. Because I think part of what I am also wondering is just, you know, there's a lot of work being done around how do we put our schools together in a way that makes sense for everybody to be able to navigate for our families and that kind of deal. But there's also that question of, do families only use us for a certain point?
Yep.
And then say, kind of take my kid out now. And I think that's the other thing from COVID that's probably been the hardest part, is that there are a lot of folks who might use our preschool services and then not come through this process, or they use our pre-K through 3 and then say, oh, now I got my kid in this other place that has this great program from 4 to 7 or whatever, 4 to 8. So I think that would be something for us to think about. I think to your point also, I think the other thing I wanted to mention is that the pre-K numbers being so high may also be an indicator of like another conversation as to what happens after. Because I think if we're not seeing the growth in K through 3 that would be reflected of the pre-K growth, that says folks aren't staying.
Right.
Those are not like folks that are out in some other place that are coming.
Right.
There's our students who have left after pre-K, and so I think those are things that we should be certainly thinking about as we're trying to figure out how we're going to build the budget.
I think, thank you everyone for sharing. I think the disaggregation piece is really important, to call again the attention to the average, including that year of COVID. In the next set of information that will fall off. However, on the slide, we did make sure that we included so you would have those numbers. So the almost 511 student drop is a $1.77 million in revenue decline. So that piece was called out here, so you have that as a hard actual number. I think the other thing, and you know, it's water under the bridge at this point. There's not much that we can do about it, but because it still includes that COVID year, you know, we know that students left because other schools were open. And so once they left because other schools were open, they did not return once they started. And so that's just the way that it is at this point. And so now how do we make sure that we are continuing to look at the stability of our schools, our recruitment efforts in the schools. We have a couple of additional charter schools that have opened up in the area as well. And so how are we continuing to combat that is really important.
Thank you, Superintendent. The only thing I wanted to add too is I have no doubt in my mind that Superintendent and Treasurer know more about this than I do. But one of the things I'm trying to make sense of is, given the fact that some of our money comes from the state, a lot of it, but a lot of our money comes from local property taxes, which does not turn on enrollment.
Correct.
So as we lose kids, our property tax revenue does not go down.
Correct.
So our dollars per kid actually goes up as we lose students. Now, I'm not saying therefore declining enrollment is a good thing. I'm just saying there's a little piece of this that's always complicated for me, because as I recognize we lose state revenue, I don't want to see a long-term enrollment decline, but we do have more money to spend per child mathematically. And so I'm registering this not because we need to go down this path right this second, but just as we're thinking about the overall budget context in the weeks and months ahead, I would appreciate some help bringing in the expenses per child perspective, because there certainly is a way of looking at this where we have more to spend per kid. as we lose some of our enrollment.
Thank you, President Lindy. The other thing that I will also share with it, and I know the treasurer and I have talked about this quite a bit, because we also receive less from the state on the dollar, where we just, our overall increase in the number of students does not always help us either, because it takes, because when we're not getting what we should receive for the students, we get more students, but they don't come in nice packages. So it doesn't mean that you get 25 new students or 100 new students and all of them are in 4th grade. And so it costs more on the other end to set up, what's necessary for the students as well. So even though we're really looking at recruitment, the recruitment is really, really important. Those are also nuances that we talk about, because as we're looking at where those students are, where they go, what do they need for transportation, so forth and so on, there's still a lot more that impacts us. So we did capture the note of the per student.
So keep in mind, so the state funding formula, we get 41 cents on the dollar right now. The most recent property valuation is going to drive that down, because as our property wealth goes up, an average against the state, our state share will go down. So I don't know when that's going to hit the formula, but that contributes to our wealth index. It's all very complicated.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm sorry.
Just help me out with what you just said, Jen, and let me preface this. Almost very first conversation, I think, on the public board conversation that occurred when Ben joined the board, and I was obviously on it. This is our very first of many. But at any rate, was this idea of growth. Because we had built into the concept, even in our last strategic plan, that growth was part of it. In part, it's probably an interest in having as many of our kids be with us, because we think we're better than anybody else, and we want them to benefit from CPS and what have you. But help me out with we can discuss about the growth and what have you. Also, the proportion of the students that we have as they are, whether it's particular needs, whether they are special needs or whether they're English language learners or whatever, the cost per child does vary based upon the need of each child.
Absolutely.
And so if you have the percentage of your kids that need greater help, happy to do it, and that's our mission, and I'm proud of that. The idea that we're spending that much more maybe on per student is because they are of greater need, versus having more students that might be, quote, of lesser need throughout the district. So there is a good and a bad both of growth or not. But Jen, I didn't quite understand what you said about the property values and the percent and the 41.
So the state share is built off of the wealth index, which is calculated with 3 factors. It's your property wealth, median income, and adjusted gross income. And it's all relative to the rest of the state. So if your average property value is higher than the state average, then you're going to get less money because you're wealthier. Thought is you have the ability to recruit local monies because you have more property wealth. So as your property wealth goes up, your wealth index will go up as long as it's increasing greater than the rest of the state is, and so your state share is going to go down because they say you have the ability to raise more of your own local funds. It's one of the biggest issues everybody has with the state funding formula.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we will continue. If we'll go to the next slide. On this slide, one more for me. On this slide at the bottom, what we talked about in terms of the notes, how the enrollment was calculated, that's there in the note for you. And so if you have a question about where the different aggregates come from, it's right there in the notes for you. Next slide. So as we think about, as we're beginning to get into the conversations, we want to keep in mind that as our treasurer discussed the $89 million and the addition of thinking about $86 million of that, we're kind of identifying right now as recurring. It does not take into consideration anything on these current slides. And so we pulled these in because these are things that we've been talking about over the course of the year, starting last year where we are now. So anything that we share today does not have, none of these things are included in any of that information. So that's ad hoc recommendations, anything with STIRS and the annual increase, preschool promise negotiations, union negotiations, potential COLA, facility repairs, the CTE expansion that there's been some conversation around, Public Safety Academy if we're moving forward there, and any other new initiatives. So I just share these here as stated because currently what we discuss doesn't discuss anything on this slide. Okay, all right, next slide. So here, and we are going to spend the next few minutes. This is an overview in terms of snapshot from where we are currently with ESSER. We provided the earlier document that we just talked through and we worked through, but here we want to go directly I'll come back to this slide, but we're going to go through here where we are currently with ESSER and what we would be proposing to have deeper conversation around as we look at how we address or begin to address the ESSER cliff. So we'll come back to that. You do have access to this, and the full our working document for ESSER is linked in here as well, and that's what we will be talking from. Next slide. So actually, let's go ahead and go through the ESSER slide. If you'll go back a slide for me. When we shared this with the unions, we went through the slide line by line, and they found it very beneficial. So we'll do the same here. If we'll go to where it says click here, and as long as you're in presentation view, it should pull it up. That's why I sent you that link.
So we should be able to click through if we're in presentation.
If you're in presentation view, you should be. And I sent it to you as a PowerPoint for that reason,
yeah,
so that you would be able to click through. Had I sent it as a PDF, you wouldn't have been able to, but you should be able to now.
And Superintendent, when you say recurring, it means the money that we spent on ESSER that would be a recurring cost, or was,
It is,
or could be.
it's the way that we're defining recurring at this point. Yes. And so that means, yes, we spend it in ESSER for example, technology is one of those areas that we spent money in ESSER for technology. However, at this point, we would have to discuss how we would redo our service delivery model in terms of technology. As soon as we can get
that's not the document.
That's not the document.
That's just the ESSER budget, but not the cliff tracker.
I tell you what, real quick, I'll just send it to you directly from the tracker document.
Yeah.
I don't know why. Okay, I'll send it to you from here, and I'll send it to everyone. But
Yeah.
then we have to make sure that it gets up on the other one so people can access it.
And I'm in presentation and I'm not able to access it.
I'm not
So-
sure why, but I'll send it to everybody
Yeah, that's
right now.
fine. Thank you.
And I do want to make sure that we get it linked though. Rob, if you'll pull it and put it up here, we'll make sure that it gets up because I want everyone to have access to it. And I'm saying, the public as well.
It's the title of the file is Cliff Tracker.
I'm sending it to him.
Sounds like a new TV show.
Yeah.
While we, President Lindy, can I ask a question?
Please.
So while we're pulling this up, Jen, I went to an Edgeonomics workshop after ESSER, and they shared with like the 180 people that were there that it is possible to, although everyone has allocated their ESSER funding and approved those budgets, it's possible to kind of go back in and say, hey, we thought that we were going to spend this on ESSER, but now we may have other needs. Is it possible for us also?
We revise the budget all the time.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we could, because we did the budget and then we got the facilities information and we talked about this. And so some of the facilities, I know we've got the whole, it has to be spent by, but maybe some of the repairs or some of the things that could be done.
Well, and that's what we did with this last revision is we put the boilers, the chillers, and the roofs as much as we could in ESSER to get that going.
Okay.
Because some of those repairs can be a safety issue.
Sure.
But my concern is we're approaching November. That money has to be fully encumbered by June and paid by September. So the work has to be complete. And with today's construction timelines, it's a challenge.
Well, of course, for construction, but I'm thinking of, and if I remember correctly from the presentation that we got, some of it is like roof repairs. Some of it is painting. Some of it is things that could potentially be done by even our people. So I'm wondering what that cost is, because if we have, and that's when I said, hey, some of those things could probably be done by June if we were. Now, construction, I completely get, but repairs, the facilities piece that we got, that presentation on was significant. And I thought some of those were things that Chief Burkhart said that could be done by even our people.
Well, they can, but whether they have the resources available to do it at the same time, because they're already working on projects.
Sure.
So it would warrant a further conversation.
And if I could also add, that also assumes that we don't already have ESSER accounted for. So right now, when we think about what's in ESSER, what we're talking about in ESSER right now, that is what the ESSER budget is charged to go against. So if we're then going to add anything like any of the conversation around the painting or the roofs or the things that our folks can actually do, that then means that something has to come out of here that's already being covered. Sure. And so that's where some of the challenge comes in, because one of the things, and we'll talk through it a little bit when we get here, but for example, there are items that we put in ESSER that we knew were operational cost. It would be great if when those items were put in ESSER, that the money for those items was maintained in the general fund, but they weren't. So something else then took the place of those dollars. So now those dollars are gone. The dollars that are in ESSER have to come back to the general fund, and we have to remove something from the general fund for that to happen. So I think that's the only piece that I would just add with that. I know that we've been doing that particular process over, I'm sure that the treasurer has done it the entire time, but when we think about what's here, adding anything else to that means that something has to come away that's already being accounted for in terms of an expense.
Sure, but I was just asking, can we go back and revisit what we allocated for ESSER spending, and then make those adjustments? That was my question. Is that is possible?
It is possible.
It is possible.
Okay.
I'm going to say this general comment, and I'll probably say it a couple more times, and we've said it a little bit before. Somehow paralleling all of this is the facilities piece itself. Right. Because the reality is this, as we heard in the fact finding, we have great needs, and that doesn't even speak to growing or expanding or even dealing with our schools that are overcrowded. Although we have some issues, like our high schools or whatever, we can move people around. So I think we also have to maybe use this budget in part to get ourselves ready for the ask that's going to be coming to the public at some point in time regarding facilities, because there's not enough general fund money or even possibility of doing all the things we need to do with our facilities. So I mean, I just kind of keep that over here, trying to figure that out. The other thing is, isn't for the September 30th deadline, which I understand, is ESSER different than what we usually have, where there's the 120 days besides the deadline in expenditures?
So all of our state and federal grants have the same 15-month cycle. So, but the money is intended to be used for the fiscal year that it's given to you.
Right.
So June 30 is, but they give you those extra days until September 30 to get the bill in and get it paid. The work has to have, the cost has to have incurred by June 30.
So the September 30 is already figuring in the 120 extra days?
I don't know what 120 you're talking about.
Again, one of the discussions in DC was this issue of this, I guess, a procedure, strategy, mechanism, whatever you want to call it, the 120-day rule.
So I think that only applies to Title I. And to capture current year expenses. The problem is when they give you their carryover dollars, they don't give it until January. It makes it really hard to spend it in such a short period. So you have they call it the 930 report, and I'm guessing that's what you're referring to for the 120. We're going to have to use that this year. We'll walk through that at Finance Committee, but I don't know that it applies to ESSER. I hadn't heard that.
If you would, and the people that were talking and presenting it, there's like a panel of 6, and 4 of them said it does, 2 of them said I don't think it does. So yeah, the check on that would be really good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And everything that we've gotten at this point, because this has been obviously at every superintendent's meeting, every summit, every conversation where any superintendent is involved, ESSER is one of those conversations. And so while we've heard that there may be some leeway on the payout of it, so that the money doesn't have to go back to the federal government, we've not heard of any leeway on the June 30 date. And so there has been some discussion around if it may take a little longer to show that you've used the monies to actually, that they've been expended to actually get the bills paid, but not an expansion of that June 30th timeline. So it could be both, one and both.
So there's, we're putting some mechanisms in place to monitor it very closely, because any unspent project, we need to pivot pretty quickly. For example, super subs are in there. If we have vacancies in super subs and that salary's not being spent, we don't want to just let that expire. We'd like to repurpose that money to do something else. We're trying to stay very closely on top of how that money is being spent.
Okay, so I think does everyone have access now to the document? Yes? Okay, great. So just to call out again, and I kind of in a broken record kind of format, like our treasurer has talked about the ESSER cliff for a long time, at least since our very first conversation in February, because we've talked about the ESSER cliff. At the very top of this document are all of those areas that were on the orange tiles from the presentation. And what we've captured here is what those areas are. In the comments, if we know of an anticipated cost for that area, we've added that to the comment, but we've not added it to the running total. So for example, if you look on row 7, facility major repairs, our estimate there was up to about $32,056 million over an aggregated 5-year period or so, 6-year period. But that's where that number comes from. If you go down to row 11, we've had conversations around smaller class sizes, consolidated or considerations for smaller class sizes. Of course, that would be pending negotiation. But if that's what happens in that 4 to 6 area, as we addressed a bit this year with our 4th through 6th grade students, that could be up to about $3 million. If we're looking to go even an increase, a greater number of classrooms that are smaller in terms of class size, we ran those numbers in the spring as we were having the conversation, and that was around $13 million. So just those areas alone, we don't have any of the other recommendations yet, but just those areas alone, that would be what we're talking about in terms of the numbers that haven't been included. We do also understand, and this was the thing that was so unique about ESSER, we also understand, and I think that this is to Board Member Bolton's point, that we don't have enough funding in general funds to address the challenges of facilities. In the facilities master's plan, and I think that our treasurer has spoken to that before, but there was a small amount that was set aside, that had to be set aside for basic kinds of things, but it was not to go back and do update on the buildings. And so that has been done, the district has done that, but now we're at a point where it's 20 year plus, we have more that needs to be done in schools and in school buildings. I don't know if you want to add anything there.
No, that's exactly right. So is the set aside for that day-to-day maintenance is $3.2 million. We transfer it from the general fund into the facility master repair fund, and they basically spend it every year on new filters and plumbing repair, little, stuff like that. It's not going to, a roof is $12 million expense. It's not going to happen through that transfer.
Okay, so digging into, going through, we're going to run through line by line, and then at the end, we'll start having some conversation, and through the rest of the presentation, there's definitely some opportunity for us to further discuss. So on line 18, if you'll notice, that is the column B, gives our current FY24 amount. Column C is saying whether or not we are recommending that we remove that from FY25. If we are recommending that it stays in FY25, then it goes to column E with the dollar amount. And if you'll notice, FY25 funding source will say TBD for every one of those, because that means a lot more work has to go into finding out where we get that money from. So starting with our first, these are the items that we have identified as one-time cost that were currently in ESSER, and that was our ventilation work, the replacement of the boilers, the chillers, and the roof replacement. That was to the tune of about $12 million. So those were one-time non-recurring dollars, and so that freed up about $12 million as we think about that's not money that we will need for next year.
Actually, it's recurring. It's non-recurring for the schools that were repaired, but that's part of that 5-year facility plan. We need another funding
Not
source.
recurring there.
Correct. Right, correct. Okay, let's go through the bottom part, starting at line 24, and this is where it gets to be a lot of fun. Over into column G.
I'm waiting for that.
I know, right? Over to column G, we have some comments there to give just a little bit of context for the area. If we have a different recommendation versus what's in there, some of those comments will say why that information is there, and then it allows us to really walk through each. As we think about our overall goals and guardrails, the first row that we have here is around our high schools, and we know that we have some additional work to do in our high schools, so we wouldn't have the specific data on those particular positions yet, but we do believe that they would be necessary to continue the work around high school transformation. The next row is athletics. So in the current FY24, information for athletics is 1.7 million. The 506 to start with, which we shared this year, was a part of the Schedule E increase. And so we would not know that we would continue to increase that moving into the upcoming year. However, there was conversation around the $567,000 for athletic trainers. So that becomes a conversation that the board would really have to have with us around whether or not we're looking to maintain the athletic trainers or not at this point. So we have that there in terms of maintaining to be determined. I do understand that athletic trainers is one of those areas that we did not fund prior to ESSER. So we added it as we got ESSER funds. The next row of 27 is on Bramble repairs. And of those Bramble repairs, 2.9 of that were one-time repair costs. So the only thing that would be recurring as we move forward would be the actual personnel for the school. And that's where the $977,000 comes from. Is everyone following me on the chart? Okay, great. All right, crossing guards. Here, our recommendation would be to request funding from the city for the crossing guards. You know, we continue to hear that the city has willingness, or I've heard it a couple of times through the board meetings, that the city has willingness to fund some of our positions. I've not heard that directly from them, but that would be one to ask them. Yeah, that'd be one to ask them to fund.
Yeah.
That'd be one. Yeah. So that would be a recommendation from us.
We're selling that railroad for about $800 million trillion.
Maybe we can get $1 million of it for crossing guards.
Everybody else apparently is, supposedly.
Yes. So if we'll go to the next column, next row for curriculum and professional development. So of the $11 million, and curriculum is a really interesting one to look at in terms of where we've been since the 18-19 school year, because we recognize, and the district actually recognized, that a lot of our curriculum had not been updated in 12 to 15 years. And so the district leadership at that time put real focus on an improvement in curriculum and did a really good job with it, in my professional opinion, in terms of the kind of curriculum we have. The challenge is, just like with anything, the curriculum cost is not one time. Much of our curriculum is also online now, and so students access it online. It's not a reduced cost for us because there is still a per student, per resource charge, even for the online curriculum. So just want to address that. But if you really want to look through curriculum and instruction and see how it's changed over the years, that was really a concerted effort to make certain that our children had curriculum in classroom every day that was aligned to standards, that was modernized in terms of the curriculum, and that will allow us, as once we know that we're using the curriculum, which we've really done a great job over the last year in being able to monitor that, I do believe we'll continue to see improvements in our students' academic performance. So for FY24, it was 11.8 million. Of that, about 4.1 million we determined that was not recurring, so that would be removed from ESSER. There is about $7 million that would be recurring. And so we broke down here for you what those different areas were, what is actually funding right now. And there's an additional $3 million that is still under review in terms of usage, in terms of ROI, in terms of what the actual item is, not just usage for students, but usage for staff as well. So that's continuing to be reviewed. So right now, that's about 7.6 that we believe from the overall 11 million that was in curriculum that would need to continue. If we go to line 30 and 31, that is an example of what I referenced a moment ago. So the custodial equipment repair and custodial supplies, that is actually an operating cost that was moved into ESSER that we would need to determine where we fund that to put it back into our general fund, because that's actually what we're using for supplies for our school buildings. Line 32 is an Edgenuity contract. Edgenuity is the resource that is used currently for specifically for CDA to offer a virtual option for the students. And while there may be another product that could do the same thing, there are a variety of products that could do the same thing. That is an item that would be needed as long as we have a virtual program, because they have to have an actual platform to use for that and to use virtually. So that's the $400,000 there. The next is our super subs, and I'm going to ask just for a moment if our treasurer will give us a little bit of historical context on the super subs. I know we talked about this quite a bit, and if she'll give some context for that.
So initially, several pre-COVID, there was a very small pilot that was called super subs, and it was an attempt to recruit daily subs to buildings that were hard to fill. There's some schools that people just don't want to go sub in. And so they were bumping up the dollar value. Instead of just a casual daily sub, they were increasing their hourly rate. And after the first year, that appeared to be somewhat successful. But then we jumped into COVID. And so we decided that we didn't want subs bouncing from building to building to carry virus across school boundaries. We expanded the super sub concept, and we put at least one in every building. And there was some formula that the talent department followed to determine how many were in each building. But so when we increased the super subs in ESSER, we decreased the daily sub cost in the general fund, because we didn't have to have as many daily subs. These were subs that were in the building full time every day, and they would cover for absences as they could.
Okay, so in terms of thinking about that, what we would be proposing would be to look at the difference in reverting back to daily subs, and the calculation would be pending, but the difference in the rate for the super subs and what we would need for the daily subs, we would have to have a determination there somewhere, but right now we don't know what that amount would be. So we're working on the calculation for that. We do recommend that the super subs is not included as something that we're looking to continue to fund moving forward, but looking at some kind of hybrid of what's happening with that, so that we're also addressing schools that have consistent great need when it comes to substitutes. The next is indirect costs, and that goes along with all of our that would be an increase to the general fund. All of our federal grants have an indirect cost that go along with them that we would have to continue to absorb in the general fund. Lobby guard, you want to add?
I was just going to say an indirect cost is an allowable amount in each grant to cover the cost of administrating the grant. So you would use treasurer accounting salaries to offset. And so in the general fiscal year 24, we reduced this treasurer's department salaries as a negative, and using the indirect cost budget to help offset that budget.
The next is lobby guard, and of course that is for our units for visitors, to make sure that we're doing the coverage for visitors as they come in. So we will look to absorb that in the security budget. For the next area, line 36, programming 2030 is how we identified that. But that covers, if you recall, I'm sure that we do, because there was a lot of conversation around it last year, the additional positions at Walnut Hills for, I think it was for testing. Testing was one of them. I don't recall right offhand the other position, but it was the entire conversation around the change in assistant school community coordinators that we were finally able to move forward on. But there were two positions that were maintained at Walnut, a position for at Hyatt Park and one at Kilgore as well. So we would recommend looking for additional funding to maintain those 4 positions. The next 3 areas are part of Project Connect. And so we would continue to look for alternate grant funding. We do understand that there would be some additional grant funding that we would be able to apply for that, about $300,000 there. But we would look for that funding, but not necessarily automatically assign it back to an area in the general fund. Resource coordinators is a great conversation, and we know that initially there was a separate grant, a separate line item from the governor's budget that we no longer have, and now we have to absorb it, or we have absorbed it in the ESSER budget. Now it's looking at absorbing it in the general fund, or how we're looking at some kind of iteration of that. I don't know if you want to add there.
So if, the history is it used to be when we started the whole community learning centers and resource coordinators were born, and we didn't pay for them. The partnerships did. And then when we helped pay for them during the 21st Century grants, when those grants went away, we shifted them to the Student Wellness Fund. When the Student Wellness Fund went away, it actually got absorbed in the state funding formula. So prior to that formula, the fair funding formula, we had about $12 million a year in student wellness, and we used that to pay for the increase in counselors and school social workers and the nurses and resource coordinators. Well, when they inserted it into the formula, that $12 million is now subject to the state share. So we went from $12 million down to less than $3 million in the funding formula. And so when that money went away at the end of last year, we shifted it to ESSER. This is the first year it's been in ESSER. So it doesn't really have a home yet financially. But that's the history of it.
So on the research, and I heard you say this, Jen, when I remember when the district first started getting resource coordinators that were being funded through partnerships, and I'm hearing you say that's declined.
Yeah, I think there's only one partner that owns their own resource coordinators. Is that right? Clicky? Is that
Okay,
it?
Correct. Right.
And was it
of them,
intentional for that to happen? I mean, is that what the district said we wanted to happen, or did partnerships just sort of choose not to fund that position?
I can't say, I wasn't part of those conversations, but in our strategic plan, we wanted a resource coordinator in every building.
Yes.
And so in order to make that happen, we ended up having to figure out a way to pay for it.
Okay. I guess the way I'm thinking about it, I'm just thinking what a wonderful way to establish external partnerships. If we could get commitment on that, and you know, that might save a few dollars. I don't know how much, but anyway. Okay. Thank you.
Right now, we pay $65,000 per resource coordinator,
Right.
with the exception of the 4 or 6 that Clicky has, because Darlene came out and her group, they continue to fund those. But all of the other ones, we pay for them. So while we have a partner that might have 4 or 5 different schools that they are the lead agency for, we cover the entire cost for that $65,000.
That's weird.
So
Okay.
that's, and that, I don't know how many years now, but I think it's been several years.
This precedes me as a treasurer. I've been there 9 years.
Yeah, everything that everybody's just said is correct. It was easier to do it this way than find a partner necessarily. And indeed, some of our partners, that's the money that they get from us that benefits them. I mean, and we have to actually be sure that it's actually benefiting our students, because there probably are lead agencies that are really not that beneficial to our schools or whatever. And there are some that are really great and some that aren't. But I think part of it is not just wanting to have a resource coordinator at every building, but it is our policy that our schools are to be community learning centers. And the linchpin of that is having a resource coordinator. So I do think it makes sense for us to kind of reevaluate that and kind of go back, but it was convenient to do it that way. And I would suggest that we look at the point that Ms. Jones is making, that we kind of figure out, no, how many days and hours? 37, who's counting?
Got the tracker.
So yeah, I think it's a good thing to reassess, and very frankly, I think we have the best group in the United States, perhaps in the world, to advise us, and that is Clicky. Because we are not taking, I know people are taking individual advice, rightfully so, from the experts, but I do think it's time to review everything, not to not be community learning centers, but to get some best ideas as to how we can go back to the original purpose.
And I will also say, as a school leader that led in 2 schools that were community learning centers, that one of the schools had upwards of 20 partners in the school at one time during the school day, not just in the afternoon. Have to have somebody to help monitor and manage that. And so while there may be a variety of ways to do that, we cover the $65,000. We don't know what the resource coordinators are paid because they are not our employees. They are the employees of the lead agency. But there has to be someone to really help really coordinate all of that in the school building. And so, you know, my recommendation would never be to not have a person to do that, because I've lived it as a school leader. And it's not something that the leader themselves can really do and organize, especially when we're looking to drive home student achievement and what's happening with academic performance. So, okay, we'll go to the next. The next is restorative practices. And so we set aside $990,000 for that this year for our year 1 work. So $490,000. Would not be in as a part of that, because we're building sustainability for restorative practices through the train the trainer model. So we started with our first set of schools. Our year 2 cost would be right around the $500,000 that we would need to determine where we support that for our year 2 and year 3 schools. The next conversation that is a huge conversation as well, and there's been a lot of discussion around this, and maybe this is something that the city will begin to fund again, even though we didn't put that there as a recommendation, but it's the school nurses. So if you'll give the historical context on the school nurses, and then we'll talk about what we see in terms of recommendations for now.
So, and I haven't memorized. So prior to COVID, we had so when we used to split share the school nurses. First, the city paid for it, then we shared the cost of it, and then we ended up absorbing all of it. It was about $1.4 million. When the student wellness money came out from Governor DeWine, we increased it to $1.7 million. And then when COVID hit and we made a decision to put a nurse in every building, and we went up, it grew up to almost over $8 million. So now we're at 5.8, not because we're reducing services, but because they can't fill all those vacant, they couldn't hire enough nurses to satisfy the need. And so the 5.8 represents how many positions the city felt they could staff. Right.
Yes. Okay, so I'm supposed to put that on.
I'm sure, yeah.
Okay, so just with that background, and initially it was what 1.7. You tell me this number all the time. What was it?
It was originally 1.4.
1.4. So in terms of school nurses, what we would propose as we move into next year. So I think there are 2 things that are true at the same time. The first is that in a school district, we have to have some level of school nursing for our students. We service our students that have a variety of needs. We service our students that are medically fragile. So any school district has to have some level of nursing services. My professional opinion, and working with superintendents across the country, unless you have an outside funder, it is not the norm to have an actual registered nurse in every school building. It's just it becomes, what do you remove in order to do that? So what we are recommending and proposing, based on the needs of our students, and that covers our medically fragile students, our students that have additional needs around diabetes care, we would recommend reducing that cost even further so that we restructure how we do the work around nursing services. And these numbers come from the team really looking at where the needs are across the district. Of course, that's a snapshot, a moment in time right now, but taking in the historical context of what we've had for the district. So to then propose that we would look at 33 LPNs, 24 RNs, and then stipends that would go along with that for additional staff that was done once before. And that would take us to about $3.8 million that we would be looking for. I make jest of it, but I don't know if this is the opportunity for us to go back to the city around this area as well, whether or not there is any opportunity for the city to fund not just the crossing guards, but also a portion for the nurses. We've not heard that at this point, but it is something that we would definitely be willing to go back and have some discussion about in terms of that. So our recommendation would not be to maintain the model that we're doing right now, but to do a model that allows us to more strategically utilize the nurses in our school buildings and in a paired format, as is done in a lot of places.
So just a quick question off of that. We still thinking about using the same model of bringing in our nurses through the health department, I think it is, as the model of getting those folks in?
I think that there's some conversations to be had around that. There are, you know, there are a lot of different opportunities to look at where we get nursing services from. There is also the opportunity for us, and I know that there's some interest with our own union leagues. There's also some opportunity for us to hire more of our own nurses. Like currently we have LPNs. I believe we have 15 of our own staff LPNs that we use right now. And so there are some opportunities there that could also give us some cost saving possibilities, as well as more direction in terms of what the nurses actually do in the building. So I know that there's interest, at least from our team, especially those that have worked with the nurses for the last several years, of bringing more in-house as possible.
Think about this also, because we've had the conversation around whether or not someone is technically actually an independent contractor or whether they're an employee. If they still dictate the work they do, time they spend, all these other factors. And so that idea, you know, even if we're using an outside agency, if we're still dictating their work schedule, the work they do in the schools, and all these other factors, we're maybe not saving any dollars by having them be not our employee versus being our employee.
Nor do we have any control over what the city has done in the past, is they negotiate raises and then we just absorb them. We're not at the table to even help negotiate. Happens with the crossing guards and the nurses.
I think as we further dig in here, there is the opportunity for us to look at, and this is not a secret, I've shared these things before, but where we can insource. And I do understand the background on why we did it another way, but you know, there are some opportunities, and I don't know that just the contracting alone is the answer, because of some of the things that our treasurer just referenced as well, and the lack of directional authority we have over the individuals that are so paramount to the work that we're doing with our most fragile students.
Go ahead, Ethan, I'll go after you.
Yeah, just I'm glad you mentioned that, because I know the very first discussion we had, I think for FY24, maybe have been 23, was this issue philosophically about insourcing, outsourcing. And I'm glad to hear that there's not necessarily a predisposition against insourcing. I'm a big believer, as many of these folks are CPS, the better. Just because we have more control and they have more ownership and what have you. So that's kind of interesting to have that kind of be off, not off the table, but something that it is a change of philosophy for your administration, I think, on insourcing more. I think that's good.
So I was just going to add some historical perspective, since I just now 2 weeks ago celebrated my 30th year with the district. So yeah,
a silver platter.
Back in the day, though, there was remember we'd just come off the Banger Commission, where the report indicated the district was bloated and had too many staff, and so there was a huge push to outsource a lot. And so there was always this fear of adding FTEs to the budget, whether it was central or not. And so everything became outsourced material. And so, which is one of the reasons why we started talking about the return on investment conversations and the concern over the insource and outsource when it comes to the retirement system and IRS rules. We started looking at, last year we just focused on vendors. This year we're focusing on those relationships and any kind of programmatic analysis, so that when we are having conversations about what scope is going to get funded, you'll have that return on investment. What's giving us the biggest bang against our goals and guardrails. So.
Okay. Continuing with the next, social workers, I think that we recognize that there is a portion of the salary for the social workers in ESSER, and so we would look to maintain that work that's happened with our social workers so we can continue to support our students at that level. Our Securitas monitoring, of course, is for after hours monitoring that we do right now, so we would look to absorb that $141,000 in our general budget. The Senior Director of Health and Safety, we would look to maintain the position, but by reviewing current vacancies in the district and refunding that way versus adding additional monies to the budget. For Student and Family Services, this covers, there's about $35,000 for a reduction in part of the enrichment, but the other $655,000 moves from our software subscriptions to transportation to the PLC stipends. And I think we recall that in policy 5820, we have our mentor programs that are a part of that policy. And that includes things like Girls to Women, Men and More. And so that the majority of those dollars are for stipends that go to staff that cover those areas. Another big one for conversation, the district prior to having ESSER funds reserved summer programming for students that needed or required to go to summer school for promotion. And so we would look at going back to the same kind of opportunity, maybe even with the possibility of doing something more virtually than actually in school buildings, possibly for the students that need it, but rethinking that entire area in terms of summer scholars. So we would recommend removing that from the budget. The next is technology. So we looked into technology. We could save, and this is an area that we want to do more discussion around. And so prior to COVID, our students did not have one-to-one take-home devices. So we know the push for COVID to make sure that our students receive the take-home devices. We have been monitoring the data for usage for students outside of the school day. And what we find is our students in K to 6 use their devices not necessarily for schoolwork or to log into Schoology or iReady or any of those programs, but they use the devices outside of the school day for at about 18%. There's an 18% usage. And for our students that are 7th to 12th grade, there's about a 27% usage outside of the school day. And so thinking a little bit more about that service delivery model, whether it's still the best thing to have students take the devices home every day. I am also a proponent of, we also pay an additional about $750,000 for Wi-Fi services for students as well. And so I'm also a believer that that is, once the Wi-Fi is given, that anybody in the household can use the Wi-Fi. So having some discussion with the city around some ownership in terms of the Wi-Fi might be a conversation for us as well. We do work with Alta Fiber, so we get it at cost, but it's still outfitting a household in terms of that work as well. So something to discuss. So our recommendation here after some follow-up, but it could be to move more to our younger students, our K-6 students, not taking their devices home, having full access to devices through a cart system at the school building, which is another way of thinking about one-to-one. So essentially what that means is each classroom, each content classroom, core classroom that needed computers would actually have carts in the classroom. And so students would move about, from one place to another and use the computers in those places versus taking them home. And continuing the way that we're doing 7th through 12th grade, unless there's conversation around changing with that as well. We're still reviewing the other monies there, but that's one of the areas that we feel if there was a change in that delivery model, it could give us some additional respite in terms of that area.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
I don't want to prolong it.
That's okay.
So current technology with the computers that our kids have, is it standard of practice right now that they are allowed to take their computers home?
They do. They do. All of our students take their computers home.
No, they don't. But I'm just saying. No, I don't mean that. I don't mean that. But I'm asking for a very specific reason, because I know that there are schools that prohibit kids from taking them home every day. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's an equity issue, especially because they have to prepare for iReady. They prepare to take all that testing. And they have to know how to use the computer, and the only way they get to do it is if they take it home. And I know that we talk about being responsible for it and all of that. I get all of that. but that's one of the things that concerns me about changing. I mean, I think they should be able to have access to the computers at home, but I know that doesn't happen.
So the design right now, so what is the protocol, what the protocol should be right now across the board is that students take their computers home. Their one-to-one devices are assigned to the individual students. There are some schools, you're correct, and we worked through it last year, but because the concern for some schools is the students take the computers home, they don't charge them, the need for repair and all of those things. But the expectation is that the students take the computers home, and more of our schools than not, the students actually take the computers home with them. So in terms of the usage though, is where we're seeing the differences. And I think that we could drill in. We know the schools that have had more concern, I can name 3 right now, that have had more concern about the students taking them home. And we advised them that they were allowed to take the computers home. And from what we understand, that has happened. But that's an open conversation. I think that there's some differing schools of thought around it. I understand it in terms of, the computers going home. The other thing, however, though, for the computers that are going home, we're not necessarily seeing the usage of those computers on the district platforms in terms of support. So the 18% that we're talking about in terms of that K-6, not all 18% of that is because they're logging into iReady or they're going into Schoology across the board. So we're really digging in there, and we could probably at our next conversation, or I could share it with you from the team, is do that by school, because we do have the information where we're looking at it and looking at disaggregating it by school. For our 7th to 12th grade population, that number is only 27%. So the same thing is also true. But for that 18%, they're using it at home for some purpose. And for that 27%, they're using it at home for some purpose. We're just trying to look at if there is an opportunity to do any savings in terms of that delivery model that will also allow us to be more efficient.
I'll just chime in for 1 second here for a time check for everybody. It's about 10:55. We have till 12:30 today. We do need not a lot of time, but a little bit of time at the end for our board priorities. And so I think we're sort of about halfway through the time that we would have for budget. I have no idea if that is great news and we're exactly where we want to be, or we're ahead of schedule, or we're behind schedule. Are we in about the right spot?
We're about where I thought we would be at this point, to be perfectly honest. But the other slides are all responsive to this. This is the real bulk and the meat of what we wanted to discuss today, because at the very end, we're going to be asking for feedback from the board in response to some of the things that we talked about.
That sounds great, because I'm glad. I think we're very much on the same page, because I think once we get through the slides, I'm sure people will have big picture thoughts and questions. And
absolutely.
A chance to align on what people should expect going forward. So thank you.
We only have 2 more on this particular page, but I hope this was worthwhile to go through the conversations and have the discussions around it.
100%.
So I do want to make sure that we have clarity around the Promise Center here. The Promise Center, this amount for the Promise Center is only for staffing. And so we want to, while we have our different feelings about what needs to happen to the facility, we do want to make sure that we review the alignment of staffing at the school, because the 2.8 is only for staffing. It doesn't cover any of the other areas at the school. Okay. And the last, of course, is transportation. The one thing that we found, and this, of course, has opportunity for more discussion, but we know that there's been a lot of discussion around, at least through ad hoc, a discussion around some level of initial thinking around reorganization in terms of grade configuration. So thinking about, expanding our K-6 model, possibly for our schools that are underutilized, to maybe go to a K-8 model, to reduce some of the 7th and 8th grade students that are in some of the high schools, to give them more spacing. And digging into this, we looked at about 4 different schools. I will not call them out right now, because that'll become something completely different, so I will not do that. But the average, one of the schools, if we moved even this coming year to a 9-12 model, which essentially would mean the seventh grade students would roll up at their current schools, and the eighth grade students would roll up at their high schools, but we wouldn't enroll other seventh and eighth grade students. For one of the schools, it gives an opportunity to save about $800,000 when it comes to busing, and the average for the other three schools that we looked at is about $500,000. And so as we get the recommendations from ad hoc, and really think through that part of it, it would give some opportunity for savings just around just the transportation piece. We know, and when we shared this the other day with our unions, one of the things that came up was, you know, the thoughts around some of the big ticketed items. Transportation is one of them. And I know that our treasurer has a perspective on this as well, but we are schools of choice. And so thinking about schools of choice causes some challenges for us in terms of transportation, not proposing differences around that thought process. But if we started with some of the high schools, I think it would also allow us to address some of the transformative needs that are needed in the high schools at the same time as we're also addressing some of the budgetary challenges that we have. So just wanted to share that right now. That's still at the $19 million.
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
So I shared this with ad hoc a couple months ago, but I went back and looked at the transportation budget in 2008. It was $21 million, and this year's budget is $51 million, so it's more than doubled. Now, what happened in that time period is charter schools were born in 2007. We started with 2 or 3, and now there's about 7,000 kids in charter schools, and the voucher program was born. And so as long as we offer citywide magnet programs and offer citywide transportation, we have to also offer to the non-publics and the charter schools citywide service, and that's what's driving the costs up.
Okay, so we have about 4 more slides, and then we will be ready to have some discussion, hopefully. And we just lost Rob. Are you going to click for us? You'll click for us? Okay, great.
Jen, I have a question.
Yes.
Based on what you just said. You said because we offer citywide transportation, we have to do the same for charters. If we did not offer citywide transportation, would that mean that we would not have to offer that for
Correct.
charters?
We have to offer the same level of service we do for our internal kids.
Okay. So in theory, our transportation costs, if we were to go to a neighborhood school model, or alter schools of choice, our transportation could significantly be
most definitely
reduced.
Yes.
Okay. Just wanted that kind of on the record. Did you hear that part? My ad hoc people? I'll put that in our report. I didn't know that part, that it has to be the same.
Awesome. So one of the things that, and I know that there were some
pseudo Rob.
One of the lessons learned from our budget conversations in the spring is one of the things that we observed, or just kind of observed, I was able to observe after the fact, is that we broke our budget process into two different structures. So we had the school-based budgeting process, and then after that was the central office budgeting process. So when we got to the point of having to begin to balance the budget, schools were already held harmless in their school-based budgets. So all of the changes that we had to do were at the central office level. And so it's important to recognize that as we begin to have these kind of conversations, schools will need to be included in the budget reduction discussion. Because if you will notice, 80% of our FY budgets is at the school or for the school, and of that, 77% is salaries and benefits. So when we think about changes and movement, there is really not a way for us to think about getting to a balanced budget without also thinking about what we're doing at the school site. So that was one of my first asks as we begin to go into this year, is thinking about it, and having worked with budgets for a long time, thinking about it as one process, not as 2 processes, so that we're able to be more efficient and more effective with the dollars and fundings that we have. Next slide.
Well, before you move on to that, I'd like to refer everybody to this document. It's the analysis of discretionary funds, and encourage everybody to think about this year's budget starting at 0, and that everything is up for consideration on change. So what I've shown you is the fiscal year 24 breakdown that creates that chart that's up there on the screen. But if you take that, the fixed costs, we have $14.4 million that goes into the debt fund, 3.2 that goes into the facility maintenance fund. We have liability insurance, it's 1.7. The district fixed costs that Dr. Moffat asked me about before is 3.6 million. And then you think about our utilities, even though they're a little bit variable based on use, you can't cut electricity out of your budget, right? So our fixed cost is 3.5 million. So those are basically the untouchable lines at this point. So which leaves you with $575 million in discretionary spending. There's also a budget on there called union contract obligations that's somewhat fixed because it's the termination benefits, which is the sick leave conversion when somebody retires. You can't cut that out of your budget. You're required to do it. All the stipends that are in the contractual CFT budget or contract are in that budget as well. So things in there that have to be negotiated. We're getting ready to come up on negotiations, so this might help drive some of that strategy because the CBA gets renegotiated or negotiated out. So then that leaves you with $563 million. And if you take out all the salaries and benefits that we have today, that only leaves you with $84 million to do things with innovative spending or mileage or office supplies. We share pens, so maybe that's a budget cut. But so that's not even 14% of the budget is discretionary given that scenario. I just wanted to keep that in perspective, Ms. Bolton.
Yeah, that's more than the federal people have is their percentage of discretionary funds, if I recall. But I wanted to say to this that part of this too, or not any part of this, but you guys have mentioned ad hoc and what have you, and schools of choice, and that there are ways also through reorganization to save or not spend money, or to spend money in a better way to meet whatever our goals are. And so I just want us to make sure that this budget process is in a time frame that allows a lot of that to at least have great discussion about, so that it's not just we're going to cut here and we're going to cut there or not there. It also is we're going to do something differently, or we're going to be asking for something different, or maybe we're not going to have the two of the magnets that we have, or what. That's part of this process too. It's not just trying to get down to this particular number, because it's huge. Be thinking of that way.
Thank you. If we could go to the next slide, we have about 4 more slides. So as we think about our budget process and development for last school year, we really looked at 4 areas: sustainable staffing, high school transformation, high quality instruction, and focused resources. And so that was the primary focus as we were looking at how we were driving the budget and moving the budget forward. This year, we know that we have our outlying areas for the strategic plan: support our students, equip our educators, connect our community, ignite innovation, and optimize operations. Next slide. So here we are. We know this. The budget cannot be built on small adjustments. Big ideas are needed. That's number 1. Number 2, in having some just initial conversation with the central office, there was purpose for doing that, because what we needed to make sure that we were able to share as a part of this discussion is we cannot consider balancing a budget with this kind of change, especially coming from ESSER, without thinking about the entire school district. And if we look at just what we may be able to do differently at the central office level, that gives us less than about $10 million that we would be able to do something with. So there's a lot of money that's left from that, but those conversations cannot wait. Budget conversations are uncomfortable. We recognize that, but those conversations can't wait because everyone needs to be on the same page about the way that we have to think through this. So as we think about big ideas that we're referring to, strategic abandonment. What are we doing now that we will not be able to continue doing moving forward? Program consolidation. That's some of what you're talking about right now. What magnet programs do we have now that maybe we need to look at consolidating, or maybe we need to reorganize or think differently about those programs? Are there any policy changes when it comes, for example, to transportation? We are still transporting students greater than the state requires. And so when we think about that, we've opted to continue doing that. We know that why it's important to our community, but it's one of those things that really we have to discuss in terms of where we're looking to go forward and what that work may look like. And then we talked briefly about service delivery changes. So one of those, as an example, could be what we were just talking about for technology. Right now, we do one-to-one for everybody. Is that the right direction to go? Should we look at doing something differently? And how is it going to impact not just the work that we're doing with our students, but work that we're doing with our schools or the work that we're doing with budget, but how is it going to impact the quality of services that we're able to provide to our students? And what other information might there be? Next slide. So we're doing some additional deep dive analysis around the following big ideas in terms of thinking about where the ticketed items may be. And all of these things are just items that we're looking at and possible considerations as we're looking at different discussions. So big ticket is the way we're identifying that, just so you will have we can frame the context, is big ticket items are those that are over 5 million. We've talked about medium ticket as between 1 million and 5 million, and then our smaller things would be things that are less than 5 million. So for example, I just referenced a few of these, but our transportation policy, our class size limits and overload, paras, and thoughts through that, anything like that, of course, we know would have to go through negotiations, but these are things that everybody has to take some level of ownership and conversation around. Grade configurations, as we were just talking a second ago, are there, some schools in a gradual model that we're able to begin the conversations around the change in grade configuration so that we're able to address the K-8 environment versus the high school environment. Title I usage at schools. I know there was a lot of discussion earlier about Title I usage, but are there other items that currently are being done that schools want that can be absorbed into the Title I budget and not just cut from the budget collectively? So it may not be something that is funded through general fund and ESSER won't be there, but is it something that could be funded at schools through Title I? And now you understand the reference for special education, but another area is special education staffing. Right now, the next role you'll see, we talk about large contracts, but I'll give you an example. Special education staffing right now. Right now, we pay over 7 million, 9 million to Hamilton County.
7 million.
We pay over $7 million to Hamilton County. The vast majority of that is for special education service support. So it's not just what schools are doing individually, but in thinking of that outsourcing and the ability to get some of those specialty roles, it's being done through Hamilton County. Overall, it's an area for us to focus on. Medium ticket items, as we discussed, as we talked a little bit about today, we pulled them from the sheet, but one-to-one device reconsideration, summer programming, nursing allocations, security allocations, crossing guards, and our large contracts, because that's the other part of this. And I say large, but we're actually going through, again, all of the contracts line by line, just as we've done before, but they have to be a part of that larger conversation around strategic abandonment. And then our small ticket things, travel, mileage, PD, copy clicks, printing and postage. And if there are any smaller contracts that could also be consolidated, and the examples that we gave were shredding and translation. This is the timeline that was shared with the Finance Committee earlier. While it is not exhaustive as we've shared here, it gave an idea of where we were looking to go to get to one, budgets for the schools, but also an approved budget and adoption. So we're right on target for where we wanted to be at this time, starting the budget workshop here, from there doing the enrollment extract, and then beginning our committees kickoff. So we have organized for committees to help work through each of these areas. Those committees do include our union leadership and their representatives so that we're able to move through each of the areas. In November, we're hoping to have our student projections and our projections appeals, such that in December, I understand that there was the agreement that we would have our staffing information to our schools hopefully before schools would leave for the winter break. At this point, that's pretty lofty for us at this point, thinking about everything it is that we have to do. But I do know that this was shared with the Finance Committee, and we understand the reason why for that. We're not looking to go through the same budget cycles that we went through last year. And then from there, January appeals for schools and central office budgets due. Any additional analysis and consideration by February, and then giving the time for the work to actually happen so that we can have our approved budget by June. Next slide. And this is the last, almost the last slide. This just gives you a snapshot of our cross-functional committees that will assist in guiding the budget development process. And so it covers everything from student enrollment projections to a relook at the staffing formulas and appeals. And again, I will consistently share that some of these areas have to go through the negotiation process because of what's currently in CBAs. But I do think that there is willingness to have some discussion around what it is that we're looking to do next. And these are looking to start the week of October the 23rd. And then the last slide. Yes, this is the last one. So this is what we need from our team. Reactions and feedback from the board. Are there any new expenditures or items missing from the list or that are able to be removed now as we think about moving forward? Is there any clarity needed on the big ideas analysis? What questions or comments are there related to potential impact to school budgets? Any questions about the timeline and any other reactions or responses? Our goal is to hopefully get some sense of where the area of focus for us based on the board should be, so that as we begin to move forward, we're moving forward with alignment with what the board is looking for us to align around and not just the recommendations that we have. So Rob, if you'll go back to the slide that shows the list of strategic, it starts with this one more right there. If we'll go back there and then if we can open up at this time, but this is all that we have.
Yeah, thank you, Superintendent. Thank you, Treasurer. So, and the timing is great. We got plenty of time. I think the request for the board, as I hear it right, are any overall reactions or questions, and then specifically any reactions to the questions you all have put on slide 12.
Correct.
Can we bring up slide 12, Rob? Board members, who would like to go first? Eve.
Yeah, I think this has been extremely useful. I think it's the timeline, and I think I might have said this finance too, the hope for timeline does not build, it's built on doing the budget pretty normally, except with more inclusiveness among administration and what have you. It does not take into account deciding and putting into effect for the following year the big ideas, because that we can't do that in this time. We have to do it starting next year, or it's all useless for us. So I think that's my reaction to the timeline. I think it's great for us to react, especially to these, as best we can, but I think it's not fair necessarily for us to be able to react in some sort of definitive way, although I know you want some definition to proceed. But I think we have to, when we do our priorities, I think it's going to be pretty obvious that this budget is going to be one of those priorities. So we almost on a monthly basis or at a meeting basis build in times for these big discussions, as well as these smaller rudimentary discussions that are still in the millions. And I think that's what we have to be doing. So I worry about the timeline and the big ideas, and I think we should go as big and as far as we possibly can. That's my recommendation, because we're going to have to. And I would just say too that I'm concerned that in the district there's this sense that people are supposed to be cutting 15% across the board. I don't know that has ever been anybody's directive or view in a district that is emphasizing equity and all these really remarkable things that you've shared today. That across the board, that might be a starting point for something, but I think it got people in a hullabaloo. But this today, I think, has been very helpful.
Thanks, Eve. Carolyn.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's funny because as you were going through the one chart line by line, and I was sitting there and I made a comment and said, wow, this is good, going line by line. And Eve mumbled to me, it was line by line, because I'm one of those people who complain about folks talking about line by line. But the reason why it felt better for me,
you admonished me.
The reason why probably a lot of people, but But the reason why I think I felt that that was helpful is because I felt like all the material was very comprehensive and it gave us a big picture. And then you all took the lead to go line by line to explain. So when we get to this, the one point dialogue geared towards decision making, some of these, I think, for example, is there clarity needed on the big idea analysis? I think we've shared some of that. But what it does for me is give me the opportunity to now go back and dig in the information a little bit to see if there's any additional clarity. I think there was a lot of clarity provided today in terms of what you and Treasurer Wagner did. So that was helpful to me, and the way I saw the information broken down was very, very helpful. There may be some more questions that I might have later, but I do agree that we have to build in time for discussions like this that are exclusive to the budget. And I think it will also be helpful once we get all the information, like from ad hoc, and I know, you know, the committee's working on that report, but I think these kind of separate conversations are much more helpful than trying to pull it all into a big old long board, B-O-R-E-D agenda.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. Others? Brandon?
So, and again, I agree with both Eve and Carolyn. This has been very helpful to see. And I think it also puts a little bit of the conversation that we have been, or at least I've been trying to do, and then I know others have been trying to do for the last kind of year, is we have a lot of great things that, you know, Treasurer Wagner's always used the example of, you know, the water bottle, right? And like we keep adding more water to the water bottle, and at some point, can't keep adding more water to the water bottle. And I think that's one of the things that we have always struggled with as a district, is we just keep adding good ideas, which are great ideas. We don't have a way to manage or prolong those things, right? And so some of this is about even going back to the schools and asking, what are you doing that is working successfully that you want budgeted for as part of those conversations, right? Because some schools will say, like, these things have not been producing the results, these things are not showing the benefits, and that's a conversation you all, like, that your teams are having as part of those different committees, right? That are going to talk about all these different aspects. For our end of it, I think it's really helpful to see this way, to Carolyn's point of being the higher picture of it. Because I don't want to know what specific community partner came into the school and did a great job in that same way, and didn't do a great job in the same way, other than to give a say, you know, as we sit in budget and finance, which contracts did you decide to put up for us and why are you removing, type of deal. But I also think one of the things that's going to be really helpful for, at least for me, and as we go forward and as we look at, you know, how the budget gets built these next few months, there is a lot of clarity that comes with making changes to how certain things operate, specifically things like going from K-8, or going to, like, from K-6 to a K-8 model at a school, or going from 7-12 to a 9-12 model. But there are challenges that come with each of those things that extend beyond just the budget year. And so the one thing that I do hope that we can have sometime for these budget conversations and these discussions is, how does this affect beyond just this fiscal year? Because I think that's one of the conversation points that I think maybe we did not do as strongly in some of the decision making in the past, is we looked at kind of what would it do for this current span of time, and then we said we'll figure out what'll happen in 4 years or in 5 years, and then we never sat down and figured it out. The other thing that I think, and I think this is maybe, I know we talked about kind of having, I think you talked about it being two different conversations, but around the facilities conversation, I think at some point we do have to connect that up to, while it may not be a part of this budget, some of the buildings can't handle the changes because they need certain facilities repairs, or they will need certain facilities repairs to kind of maintain certain things, or to make it more, you know, technology driven. If we're going to add any kind of technology to certain spaces, you have to update certain things, do certain work. And I think we had a great conversation during the financial town hall about how, like, some of these things are about, quite honestly, like health and safety of the students. These things are things that we really do have to press folks on. And so I think us having the budget conversation allows us, and doing it in a great way, allows us to be stronger when we come back and say, hey, we got these buildings we need to figure out how to do repairs on, see how great a thing we're doing here to manage your funds, see how great a thing we are doing here to keep doing great programming. And I think some of that to me is also about the narrative that we have for the conversation. So I think sometimes we don't do that in a way that explains to the public, we are doing great things still, we are being great stewards of the funds. And so I think the two things for me is, again, think about how those things affect multiple years out. And then the other part is, how do we connect those conversations to things we're going to be asking for additional revenue for in the future, such as facilities, such as preschool promise, the other things.
Thank you, Brandon. Kareem.
So I think this was great information. So I think it's hard to see and it's hard to discuss and manipulate. Hard to have these conversations when you're talking about money, but and potential cuts. But it's a necessary conversation. So thank you, both of you, for this work. I know it's not necessarily fun and sexy, but it's necessary. I thought it was very, very helpful. I am very interested in, let me ask my question first. All of these proposals are keeping what we have as far as personnel relatively the same. It's just making potential cuts or adjustments regarding ESSER and how that impacts the budget. Is that right?
So the goal, so I can't say yes, because right now what this says, that's our goal. Our goal would be really to maintain our personnel. The challenge is, if we go back to the slide that shows the amount there, the one that has the extra totals on it. I want to say it's about $60 million that we've identified, and I'll pull it up real quick. On the last row, on row 52, it's about $65 million right now that, if nothing else changes, we would be saying that we need to absorb this somewhere in our general fund budget. The problem is there's not $65 million available in the budget. So it would mean that we would have to make a decision on what we would recommend to take out of the budget to put these things into the budget.
Right. So that was just my clarity question. I wanted to make sure that I clarified that.
Okay.
I thought that, but I wanted to be definitive. What would help me, and this is probably a learning style, I am most interested in things that directly impact students. So when we talk about technology and in theory and practice how things are supposed to go and how things are going, it makes me cringe a little, because technology is where we are going societally, and to cut those things when I know that we're not efficient with the usage currently bothers me. When we talk about nurses and have a definitive practice or a definitive proposal around nursing, it bothers me because we have a significant population of students who are missing school. So we're talking about, or who their learning is impacted. So we're talking about reduction, and I know that there's a significant number there. So I would love to see this in the big spreadsheet that we had, where with those numbers that are directly impactful to students, like they touch students in some way, because that will let me know, like for curriculum and instruction, that would be the one that directly impacts students. How that looks, I get that. It could be in software development, I understand, but I'm concerned with cutting things that have a direct impact to students, and we are not clear on the efficiency of the usage currently. So that's kind of why I'm big on the auditor and like, hey, can she come in and do some work to let us know where we could make some improvements, and then maybe our return on investment would be a little bit more significant. But this is great. I do think we are talking in ad hoc, and I'll have the report ready. We are talking about some things that may help us with regard to transportation, neighborhood schools, schools of choice, which may also help with the bottom line of the budget. But I think that this is a great start. I do really have some just some concerns about cutting things that really direct student learning. And then the broad stroke of, hey, every department cut 15%. There are some departments, or whatever the number, there are some departments that directly impact engagement, or they are directly, they may not. So to cut them just feels like we're not aligning with what I think our budget is bigger than just the goals and guardrails that we set. I feel like our last budget, we aligned that to the strategic plan, and it had things in there like resource coordination. You had mentioned that. The resource coordinator position aligned with the strategic plan. That's not really anywhere in our current plan, but there are still priorities that we want and that we need for the learning of our students. And if we simply water it down to just sticking with goals and guardrails, we may miss some things that are really, really significant to our communities that could help us. So the only other thing I would add in my soliloquy is there an area that we've explored potential partnerships so that we could save money? And then because we talked, I like the example about resource coordinators, and maybe we give them 65 million, but maybe we go down to 40 million, or I'm sorry, 65,000. And we go down to maybe 20,000 and ask the partners to increase that. Are we looking at opportunities to get our partners to buy in, and what dollar amount is that? Is there a plan for asking our partners to step up and be fiscal partners in the work that we're doing as well? So I think those are just kind of my high level things, is kind of what's the plan. And I think we should ask the city for help. I think we should flat out ask the city for what we need, and that's the benefit of our meetings, is that they're at the table. But I think a lot of it is awareness too. So those are just my overarching thoughts. But great job in the foundation.
Thank you. My brain is as crazy as some of the decisions will have to be, and as hard as some of the decisions will have to be. It's now far more doable, at least for me. So yeah, and the list up there, I got about 3 of those covered. So well, first I'll ask a question about potential impact. The only thing I wasn't clear on, and I could have missed it, was the when we did the special ed piece, and we talked about, like, for the staff or whatever, would it be a reduction in staff? Do you think and maybe you can't answer, and that's fine. Do we think we might have too many people, or what would that specific recommendation entail?
So I think the first is we have to go back and do an analysis of how we're currently doing the work for special ed. That is not going to be one that's going to be as fast, because much of what happens, of course, with special education is written into IEPs, and therefore, is that the right direction? So it does allow us to look a little bit more at tuition, to look a little bit more at how we are aligning with the state and the requirements from the state in terms of ratios for individuals, as well as if we're doing more than the state allows, like the example the state recommends, like the example that I gave in terms of the autism units only require 1 para, but we have 2 in our service delivery model. That's one piece. I think the other piece of that that's also relevant when it comes to special ed is the treasurer raised this, but we have an inordinate amount of students. Just being a special educator, we have an inordinate amount of students that have positions for one-to-one paraprofessionals. And I say positions because many of those positions are also vacant. And so when we do the alignment work, are we writing these things in because it's something that's needed and we're not able to address it? Is there another way to think strategically about how we're able to do that? So it's going to take some deep auditing work, but also from individuals that understand special ed. Not everybody can go in and audit special ed.
Cool. Thank you.
One more comment on that. So on the one-on-one paras, so if it's written into the IEP, we have to budget a body.
Right.
But if the position's vacant, we can't just say, well, sorry, you can't have that person.
That's right.
So we also contract for the same, so we're always double budgeting for the same service. So we need to figure out a better way to handle that.
I figured that one was super complicated because, and like with the IEP, that's a position where there's some things you don't have any choice to cut. You have to do them. And so that is exactly what I figured was probably happening. So I appreciate that. And also, to your point, while I am not want to look for the silver lining, and I'm not proud of that. It's just not really, I'm not hardwired that way. you know, you said it with the special ed, and you brought it up with transportation. We talked about it a lot in policy committee. You know, unlike other school districts, it's come up with neighborhood schools and how every school is school of choice. We do a lot of things that we don't have to do. And while what I'm about to say, I don't think makes this any easier, unlike a district who is already just doing the bare minimum and has to have the same conversation, we're in a position of privilege in some respects where we can say, well, we're sorry, we've done this for 30 years, maybe we can't do it anymore. And again, I don't think that makes it easier, but to me, it's a little different than saying we're doing the bare minimum and we have to go below that. So anyhow, I just want to put that out there. A couple thoughts then, and then not suggestions, but things I saw that I'll go out right out and say I think they seem sound, partially because I and others in this room have already suggested them in the past. But first, just a couple thoughts. So the city piece, I think most folks know, like my real job is messing with the city in their budget and their, you know, politics for nonprofits. They don't have any money either. They are not going to be in a position to, we can have all we want. We can have meetings, we can take pictures, we can say, look what we did. They're not going to have it. And if that railroad sells, they have certain things they have to spend that on, and it's not us, unless they buy our buildings, and then they can say but I'm obviously joking. So I do think, you guys want to buy Woodward? You want to buy Hughes? I think it's a good investment. I do think we need to figure out how to work with them, obviously, in some of these things. I just know how hard it's going to be for them, no matter what, going forward. And, you know, in the social service sector, you know, what you hear, and it's what we hear, and it's what we're going to continue to hear, and for good reason, is, man, we want to do something about fill in the blank. But then we have this, $65 million hole, et cetera. So I just think we need to be aware of that. And careful about what we think we can ask, and maybe even what's promised, either officially or unofficially. Another thing I thought was interesting was the resource coordinator conversation. I remember this. I think I was here with that $65,000. I think it was kind of around COVID time, and we kind of came with that blanket number. They're not all administered the same. Again, to harken back to my other life, friends with most all the agencies, and I work with them professionally in other capacities, not in this capacity, that serve in our schools. And you know, they're paid different. The expectations are different. Some report more to our people than their people. It's kind of all over the place. I'm not a huge fan of uniformity and everything, but I think this is something that has to be somewhat streamlined. I mean, maybe if Miss Kamine and her people are watching right now, y'all want to do you guys want to pay for all of that? We love you so much, but we have to figure something like that. Was the beginning of the negotiation. We had to figure something out there. And then lastly, you're welcome. And then thoughts, kind of thoughts. Dr. Moffitt already said something about this. You've all said something about this. I just want to add my 2 cents. So some sort of hierarchy of need. What is our hierarchy of need? Our Maslow hierarchy of need for our students? Obviously, the answer is everything, of course, but there are some things that are just not going to be there. And then hierarchy of need for facilities. And I think it was Ms. Jones, somebody brought this up, like, what school is not safe? We would do this, and which ones are, and I know y'all are doing this. I just want to lend my support for that. I think there's some sort of hierarchy as we move forward. And then lastly, and this is where ad hoc committee came from, and Mr. Davis was on this board talking about this years ago. We have to rethink the high school thing, and everybody can go everywhere. And, you know, and I'll say it, it's unpopular, and that's fine, but it's not sustainable. We have already actualized savings and improvement in transportation. And we didn't do it by magic. We did it because you led a process, we made decisions, and we changed things, and the board agreed on it, and it worked. We're just going to have to figure that out somehow. Again, it won't be easy, but I think those are my thoughts. So thanks again, though. This really, really helped put things like in order for me.
Thank you, Mike. I'll share because I haven't gone yet, and then if people have other comments, they can go again. I just had one piece of positive feedback, one question, and then a comment I want. I think that the positive feedback, there's a lot in this morning that's been really helpful. I would just say that what was particularly helpful for me is slide 8. And if you wouldn't mind going back to that one, Rob, for just a second. And I think it's the headline on the slide says it all. I'll just wait till it comes up here. Here we go. Yeah, the budget cannot be built on small adjustments. Big ideas are needed. And not just to say that, but to put some numbers and examples behind it. If we shrunk the central office supply budget to 0, not reduced, like to 0, and did all of these other things, the maximum amount of savings we'd find is less than 10 million when we need at least 65 million and maybe more. And I just think anytime you're trying to solve a problem, it's really important to name it and to size it so that you can align your efforts in the right way. And I just found this incredibly clear and incredibly helpful. I don't know what the answers are. I think we'll have to figure that out together in the coming months. But it feels really good from my perspective to be this clear on the size of the issue this early in the year, as it's October. And so I think that I just want to offer some positive feedback and say thank you. My question, only one, everything in here, I think, has making the assumption that the strategy has got to be about reducing costs as opposed to increasing revenue. And I think that's fine. I'm not advocating that we try to increase revenue, but we also had a presentation not long ago and a fact finding around facilities needs. You know, and my sense from that was there's no way to find that kind of money if we're trying to shrink costs and do this at the same time. So could you just talk for a minute about, and I want to be really clear, I'm not advocating as of this day that we go for a tax increase. But it sounds like you've come to the same conclusion. Can you just say a little bit about your thinking on that front?
Thank you for the question and thank you for the feedback. So I think that what the picture that we want to make sure that we paint is the picture that something major has to happen. So as we begin to think about moving forward, I know we've had the conversations around levy conversations potentially around facilities and looking at how that might allow us to sustain. But there is a real, there is a space to have additional dialogue as to whether or not after we're painting this picture and after we are doing everything that we can do to address these areas, if that is something that we look at next, you know, engaging around that conversation. So I think ultimately with what I know about budgets, I think it's gonna be necessary. And when I look at what school districts are having to do across the country right now, I also think that it's something that's going to be necessary for us to further discuss.
And I think just to make sure I'm following, necessary at some point. Well, question mark around then.
Correct, and this is the reason that I say that. If we decide, or if the board decides right now, and the treasurer and I have had the same conversation, and I think we've had the conversation kind of jointly, especially as we talk through facilities, through the facilities fact finding. If the board says right now, yes, we're looking to move forward with trying to get on the ballot and going for a levy, that won't fix where we have to be in June of 2024. And so with that being said, we have to think very strategically and very quickly around where we go next in order to prepare us for our students that will be returning in August of 2024. So when I'm saying not right now it may be the time to have the conversation so that we're looking at when is the next possible time that we can get on the ballot for that. Yeah. It just won't address where we need to be in terms of June.
And that makes sense. And I think it's a bridge to the comment I wanted to make at the end too. And I think that issue will come up, you know, like as we're trying to get all of our different stakeholders to understand the size of this problem and the approaches that we're taking. It's going to come up. Well, why not go for a tax levy? You know, so I just want us to have a good answer to that. And I think that so I did my positive feedback to my question. I think the comment is, I think one of the most important roles that our board can play, along with our leadership, is to tell a really simple, clear story about what's happening, what we're trying to do, and the process that we're going to follow in order to solve it. I agree completely with, I think it was Board Member Bolton, but on the timeline, it looked like a very good timeline for a normal year, and this is not a normal year. And so I think being able to say really clearly to particularly our staff, because I think they're the ones who are going to have the most questions about it, and understandably so. But also to anybody in the community, here's the size of the problem. Here's where it came from. We're not alone. Almost every other district in the country is facing a similar problem. Here's the timeline and the process we're going to use and that you can expect from us around landing some of these major decisions that are the kinds of decisions we're going to need to make in order to solve the overall problem. So that we're just managing everybody's expectations towards how big the issue is, when they're going to hear things from us, where they're going to have opportunities to share feedback, and when decisions will be made and by whom. And that, nobody needs to like all of those decisions. That's not possible. But I think we play our best role when we can tell that story and that process in a really clear and consistent way over and over and over. This is the last thing I'll say, and then I'll stop talking. I think I like what Mr. Murawski said around the Maslow. I hadn't thought about that analogy, but I think that's great. Because like our job, yes, one of our jobs is to be financially responsible and make sure we have balanced budgets. Our bigger job is to make sure we are providing places for children that set them on a path to the career and the life that they want to have. And so I think to somehow weave into the story that we're telling that yes, we are trying to balance a budget in a really challenging environment while also dramatically improving student outcomes. And that's hard to do, but we can do it. And if nobody's going to rise to that challenge other than us, who will? And so I appreciate that, and I'm hoping that can be a part of the story that we tell.
Thank you. Just a few responses. Okay, so thank you for that, and thank everyone for the feedback. Just to give just a little bit of information and to also assist in managing expectations a bit. So as I've shared before, I've worked on budgets for a very, very, very long time. And my math brain does not allow me to not speak in numbers. Because when you look at our budget, the portion of ESSER that we have to remove is about 15% of our overall budget. So when we're talking about that 15%, that wasn't pulled from just nowhere. That was pulled from the fact that the ESSER budget that we will no longer have, I think the actual number is like 14.2% or something of our budget. So that's a rounding to a 15%. So that's number one. The second is, in terms of thinking about preliminary recommendations, if you'll go back to the same slide that President Lindy referred to, in order to get to this number, a concrete number, not a number of this is what we think may happen, just with leadership at the central office level, there needed to be some discussion with them so that we could give some level of clarity around this is what this piece would look like. Because if not, the conversation becomes, what can we remove from the central office to address this budget? And knowing that last year, everything that we did in terms of addressing the budget came from the central office, it was necessary to have some dialogue to then say, if preliminarily we had to reduce just your budget by 15%, taking out what you currently have in ESSER, what would that do to the department? And so that was clarified just when the conversation started, but we wouldn't have been able to give you this number that is a concrete number without having those conversations. So I think that that's the second part as well. I think the third part, and this is where, we do need some additional feedback, because some of what is in the timeline is currently in the CBA for conversations around when we would give information to our union partners, when we would give information to the schools. So that's going to take some discussion. And I do think our union partnership at this point is aligned with our conversations. We've done the same presentation with them. They gave back some of the same information that you provided today in terms of one of the questions that came up was about, thinking about schools of choice and those kinds of things. The challenge is, in order for this to help us for August, we have to have the conversation about beginning to make the change now. So in thinking about it, if we are looking at expanding some schools to K-8 or in a process of that, and I'm saying process because it grows up to that space. If we're looking at some schools to start with, and I don't know that there is a recommendation that there will ever be an all, but if we're looking for a space where there would be a start for some of the high schools moving to 9-12, we can't wait for that until next year, because it will not help us with the deficit that we have now. So what we would have to be able to do is get some of that information, determine the best space to have that conversation with the board so it doesn't send everybody else into panic before we can then begin to go to schools, socialize it with schools, socialize it with LSDMCs, get feedback from parents. All of that is a part of a process. Having gone through this for a long time, all of that is a part of a process necessary for change to take effect in August. The one thing that we did this year, anticipating that some of this was going to happen and conversations would have to happen, is the application process for Magnet and all of those programs does not open until December instead of September, because it was September. So we moved that back, anticipating that there would need to be conversation around what we needed to do next that could impact us going into next year. So just wanted to kind of put that out there preliminarily and where those things came from in terms of how we're looking to bring information back and how we're able to do that again such that it is structured enough that everybody is getting the same information at the same time and we don't have one or two people that are feeding information out that they're not completely clear on. So that's something else that's really important.
So we had Eve and then Carolyn.
Yeah, thank you. And I don't disagree with anything you just said, but I want to make sure, because this has now been shared, it's been shared. It isn't that now we can go back and say, well, the board said okay to all this. Well, no, the board didn't. The board is thrilled to have this information to be thinking about, to kind of create the parameters for our board discussion and thinking and what have you. I get the point about the overall 15% and the amount of money. I just think it just the across the board, everybody doing 15% that's what made people freak out, and rightfully so, I guess. But beyond that, this sounds stupid, but a couple of charts back, there were columns and it said savings. You know, the language always kind of determines what's happening or how the discussion takes place. Just by using the word savings instead of costs or whatever, it leads people to think that we're cutting. This is not about cutting as much as it's about examining the costs that we have. It was like there were 3 columns. I can't remember.
Keep going. Keep going.
The greater than 5%. Yeah.
It's whatever it was, but it was cost savings or savings here, savings there. And recommendations, it's just better, and we've said this before, if the word is proposals. Because it just, again, keeps the dialogue kind of, I think, happening. And to Mike's point, and I tease about it, the city, they don't have any money. And I don't know, they're going to have any rail money at the rate this is going too. But I think the thing that we have to say is if they can't pay for it, I'm going to say it as I've been saying for years, then I want to control it. And because it's just ridiculous for us to pay for somebody else to control people so essential. So that's all part of that big thing. But I'm thrilled we're talking about big things. Last thing I'll say, I'm excited about all this. This is a great opportunity. It's hard, but this is the biggest chance we've had to really affect change and move ahead, I think, that in any number of years. And I think we should embrace it, as difficult as it's going to be. And I do like the idea of the schools and the central office, the whole holistic budget. I think that makes complete sense. There you go. Yeah. Big ticket savings, medium ticket savings. Just even if it says something else, costs or just savings means, okay, we're cutting that, we are probably, but that word.
Just
yeah.
Big ticket, medium ticket, small ticket. You don't need a third word.
Yeah. It just, the way, it's the language.
Their fault.
Yeah. There you go.
Thank you, Eve.
Thank you.
Carolyn?
Okay, I don't want to be too redundant, but I have to say some things to the points that people are already making. Number one, I really like Mike's thinking about looking at the hierarchy and needs and priorities as it relates to what Dr. Moffitt said, student outcomes, because that's what our goals and guardrails say. So I think us talking more about what that looks like from a budget perspective would be helpful. Number two, I think at some point, not now, maybe not in the near future, I think it's likely that more revenue or a discussion about that is absolutely going to be needed.
Yes.
So that's a given. Number 3, we talk about the city. I think it's fair. We have this collaborative relationship, and it cannot be one-sided. It cannot be for publicity. It has to be real. So the conversation has to be, what can we do to share kind of the resources and things? And they, we don't have the money either. So we got to figure out, but these are their, they live in the city, so we should be having that conversation. And then finally, one more point before I go final, but the reimagine, in ad hoc, we talk about reimagining the district. And that's what this feels like to me from a budget standpoint. Mm-hmm. And we know we have a timeline for right now, what we have to do right now, but as we move toward ad hoc recommendations and that one slide where you had all this stuff up there, I think it makes sense that this is what we're doing and this is real and this is needed. And I appreciate that. And given that, my last point is the more buy-in that we get from the people who work in the district particularly, but even with families and community people, the more buy-in we get. And I'm not necessarily talking about a whole strategic process where we're out going, I think that let me just make this point. One of the things since I've been here that I hear every year is people blame Jen. Prior to you, they blame Jen because they don't get what they want in their budget. But if they understood the context of these changes the way we understand it, not every single slide or every single line, they might be a little more understanding and forgiving and give us grace to things that we need to do, because and folks need to understand they're not the only entity. So one school is not the only school in the district, and they have to look at it from a big picture. So if we can get them as involved as we can in giving them the information so that they know and they have the big picture, I think the better off we'll be. But yeah, I'm done.
Thank you, Carolyn. Request from Brandon.
So I want to say first, I'm happy to have Mike back today because he actually triggered something in my head that I wanted to say. So I'm glad to have you back today, Mike. Which is actually a conversation I had with some folks. And my question is more, we built our budget based on this idea, and I think sometimes we probably extend this idea, but this idea that we will be able to hire all the folks that we had budgeted for in some ways, right? Like we budget out as if we hire everybody, this is what we're going to spend, and invariably we generally don't.
We also do budget a negative vacancy amount, a vacancy savings amount. Yes. Yeah. So, but like
the idea is that even the folks that we are saying in our budget, we're going to have these folks hired. Essentially, is what we've said in a lot of ways. And so, in some positions we do that, some positions we don't. I think the special ed area is one example of that, where we recognize that we're not always going to get the pairs. We have to find a remedy for it, but it's not something we can necessarily pull out, right? And in others, there are other vacancies that, even we talk about smaller class sizes. We had that conversation, but we also recognize that we didn't fill up the teachers with class sizes that we had. So it's also that conversation point around that I think for a lot of schools, they have that conversation differently, right? And so I'm reminded of a conversation I had with a teacher who was saying like, oh, like we didn't get X, Y, and Z. And it's like, well, you budgeted for these things. Now, whether or not you all spent it on X, Y, and Z is a whole different thing than what we budgeted for. And I think that's part of that conversation that we have to make sure that we're talking about is that, and I think we talked about this with going back to the zero-based budgeting, is that like, yes, I know you always budgeted to have 12 people, but did you need 12 people? Or did you just budget 12 people because you never had more than 10, right? Or like things like that I think we have to be able to do that conversation as part of this model, right, to think about. But that also may get to how you reimagine the school, how you reimagine programming. If there's a school that has a program that's not generating great results, it's not building up succinct efforts, is not something we can continue doing, how do you reimagine to get those benefits to the students so the student still gets a great quality education while that programming may change or may verge out? And so I think it reminded me of that kind of conversation that we sometimes have where people think about that all of this stuff is just like, we cut a budget item there, that means every person is no longer, and we never provide this service again. Well, no, we may be doing this differently. So I think sometimes the wording is a big part. The other thing that I was sort of thinking about, and I think maybe this is something we as a board can provide some assistance on, is I think invariably there's going to be something that's really hard for somebody to take that's going to be done based on this budget. Somebody's going to feel some huge cost to this, and they are not going to be happy. And in a lot of ways, to Carolyn's point, folks always used to blame Jen when they didn't get something in their budget. I think in some ways the board has to be there to provide this kind of cover for the hard decisions that all of us are going to have to make. And I think that's one of the things I'm really hoping that we in this process can do, because what I'm really afraid of is what I've seen from some folks on other things, and I will throw some people under the boat, because we always get the conversation around, like every time I'm out somewhere with some people, you get the weird conversation around really specific things, like Schedule E is a great example, right? Where like every person's not happy with Schedule E, and they're like, I should get more of this. At the end of the day, that decision is made through a process. There's decisions there. If we don't own that conversation in some ways and say that this is what we decided as the best way to educate our students for the amount of money that we have to do this work, these were tough decisions. They weren't easy. People were hurting because of some of these decisions, but the reality is that this was what we could do to do the best thing for our students. Like there's some level that I think the board will own, and I think that's the messaging part, is that if we don't own that message in a way that shows support for you all, as you all get the arrows thrown at you for these decisions, I think the future years will be much more difficult to even make basic decisions. So while we're in a weird year in budgeting, I do think it owns us a little bit more to own the results, I guess, at the end.
Thank you, Brent. Kareem?
So I agree with some of what board member, Vice President Craig said. I don't know if we're being formal with Brandon or whatever. I don't know. Yeah. All of the above. All of the above.
For life.
So I agree with what Brandon said. But I do want to offer, and again, this is kind of my last go around at this. Some of the things that have been said are really, really poignant to me, and they mean a lot. I do talk about reimagining education quite a bit, and I believe post-COVID, our kids are not the same type of learners that were sitting in the seats prior to COVID, and so I think we owe it to them to reimagine. And I think kids are resilient, and I think families are too, for the most part. Which brings me to my next point, and I would just really want, if anybody wants cover, to me, we need to increase awareness and engagement with the community. I think the great thing about Just Ask Jen town halls is that people now have been somewhat prepared about nurses because we've been talking about it for a year. I don't think
3 years.
What you say?
3 years.
Yes. But we've been recording it on camera now for a year. And so we can go back and tell people, hey, go to that ESSER conversation that we had last September and watch the video. And the analytics is there that people are actually doing that. They're going back. We talk about it one time and then we redirect them to the conversation. And I really believe that awareness is key for all of these things that we're talking about. We're talking about some big decisions, but I think that the community is pretty much prepared because we have a lot of attendance at ad hoc. We have a lot of people coming and asking questions, and we are pretty candid in there to say we're talking about what's going on with a potential middle school option. We get sidetracked, to former President Jones's point, we get sidetracked a little bit on specific schools, but we are talking about having to do something different for our district, and people understand that. We've said before, hey, we can't afford to keep doing what we're doing. Again, I think the city is unaware, and to everyone else's point, I think we need to flat out ask them what we need, because they act like, oh, we didn't know that we weren't paying for crossing guards. Well, now you know. So we've said it publicly, we've said it in our multiple meetings, and I think we need to increase those partnerships. The last thing I want to talk about is it possible to align color code align the strategic plan and the budget item? So is it possible to see how this, I don't want to say savings, I don't want to say cut, I don't want to say, how this dollar amount aligns to
Reimagine that.
yeah, this number aligns to some place in our strategic plan, and so that we can demonstrate to the community that we are trying to, another way to try to be fiscally responsible. Again, rating that in a hierarchy level as well. Because what bothers me, I'll tell you what's stuck in my craw, is in that strategic plan, I don't readily see engagement, like engagement. But I see goals that are academic in nature, but I don't see engagement. And I don't want us to forget about some of the things that make our district just cool. You know, we've got our community learning center model. Where is that? If we're talking about resource coordinating and we're talking about impacting that number, where is that aligned to in our strategic plan? Where is that numerically on the budget? You know, I see the budget number, but does that align to what we believe in as a district? So it would just help me to see those things kind of color coded and aligned in a hierarchical fashion for me, and that would, again, that will help me go out and champion for the district about what has to happen, if I can understand it. And I think that people will be open to it. I think our employees, our staff will be open to it. They just have to be engaged and included in the process. So that's the only thing I would ask, that we do that.
Thank you very much, Kareem. Anything from Mike? So I think then, any closing thoughts or comments from the superintendent or treasurer?
I think for me, and again, thank you for the feedback. I would like to get to those 1 or 2 or 3 things that the board is saying, yes, we do, you know, we're good with you moving forward and doing some additional research around this, because one of the things that I just want to continue to elevate is whether we like the word savings, whether we like the word removal, whether we're using the wrong terminology in terms of proposal. We have $65 million that we have to find somewhere else in the budget if we're going to maintain the things on this sheet. And so I don't know another way to say that, because that is just a reality for where we are. So I don't necessarily, and again, wanting to move forward in terms of clarity, I want to make sure that as we begin to move forward, get information, do engagement, and all of those things in about a 2 or 3 month period from what we're trying to make sure that we're able to bring back. We're doing that with the understanding that, for example, if we discuss moving a school and recommend and engage with the school, everybody is not going to like the fact that that school has to go or is going to a K-8 model, for example. But that has to start this year in order for us to actualize. What I have some concern around is we're looking for savings and adding at the same time. So, for example, one of the reasons that it's beneficial for us to think about schools that we may be able to move to a different model right now is because immediately, not a year from now, it changes our transportation costs for those environments. When we go to full 7-8 on yellow buses, we know what that did to the budget as well. And so in terms of that, how do we ease our way into trying to get some of those staggered savings back while also looking at programming? That's number one. Number two, when we think about our schools of choice, our magnet programming as well, we've done the study around where we are with the programming. And in some instances, it is more the school of choice option that has individuals going to the program than it is the magnet program option. And so in terms of that, if we say, okay, this magnet program is being consolidated with this one, I'm just using an example because these are the kind of proposals that we would have to bring back in terms of having dialogue. If we're doing that, that's not something that could wait a year removed. That's something that we would have to move forward with. And that means certain things like not having transportation if individuals want to continue in a school building, and then we'll get the conversation around, well, that's not equitable. And so we really have to think through, because none of us want to do this. I don't either. This doesn't feel good at all, but we're here and that's what we have to do. We have $65 million that we have to find in the budget, and we're not going to be able to keep the other part the same. So I just some clarity around information, when we're looking to come back, what we would talk about in terms of engagement. If that's something that needs to be, if I can get some guidance from the board first, then we can go back with the team, the group of the teams, and come back with some proposals. After we've done some additional engagement, we're able to do that, even some surveying, after we have done presentations, and we're able to do some clarity around that.
So Renee, can I just try to play back what I think
Sure.
you're asking us for? Because I want to make sure I've got it. I think I hear you saying you want to make sure you have the board's support to do the following. Look into different options we have for how we could close the $65 million gap. That would include, or could include, conversations with schools, conversations with families, conversations with community stakeholders. And or are you asking that, or are you asking like that plus make those changes now?
No, I don't think that we're in a position where we can make the changes now. I don't know that we have enough information.
That's what I thought.
In terms of the ESSER recommended or proposals that we're offering in terms of ESSER,
Yeah.
that's the background that we have right now. So if we took that sheet that we shared and we said, okay, now we're going to move forward. Yes, we're good with this. Yes, we're good with the change that we're talking about for nurses. Yes, we're good. Whatever the things are on that sheet, then we would know as we're beginning those other conversations, okay, this is an amount that we need to actually go into the budget and try to find what we're going to remove to address this particular area. But I don't know that collectively we're in a space to say, yes, we want you to support this, or no, not. So it's really the first.
You're looking for our support to be able to go do like comprehensive, thoughtful engagement and research on options.
That's correct.
But
Yeah.
no, that's clear.
So people are saying different things. That's why I want to make sure that we're in the same spot.
I'm hearing that I'm hearing that, but I also think that what I hear you saying is that there are some pieces that we still haven't done. And one of them is the ad hoc. Let's just, I mean, that's such a big piece of this. So in order to move forward with things that have to happen this year, we need to have
get clarity on that.
And get clarity around what's going to happen in the future. So, and I know that the committee is well aware of the need to get those recommendations.
That's correct.
Okay, Jen, then we'll go to Kareem.
So I am concerned about the timeline as well. Most of that timeline that was up there is tied to teacher transfer rounds that are in the collective bargaining agreement. So that's a conversation. It sounds to me like I'm hearing we should be delaying the process to get some of these broader agreeing consensus around what's going to happen. If you recall, I originally asked if the ad hoc committee report could be done in August because Jeremy can't do projections until he knows where the kids are going, right? So if we do projections now and it's supposed to start on the 15th, take the extract on the 15th, he has to know what direction to go in order to do projections, in order for us to start staffing. So, and the other comment I wanted to make is, and so we need to kind of agree on what timeline we're really going to look at and start communicating that, because people are expecting us to follow the old timeline. The second comment is I would advise not to focus on the 65 or the 86 because that's just the ESSER portion.
Right.
You have all these other things that are coming up. One of the line items that we didn't really talk about, and it's new, and I'm not even sure you're aware of it, is that there's a recommendation to increase this teacher's retirement for district's portion of it from 14% up to 18% over a 5-year period, so, or 6 years, increasing 0.5% a year. Well, that's going to cost the district about $3 million a year. So that's an additional item that's not in our current budget. And so you have to make room for it. We can't increase the budget value. We don't have the cash to do that. I'm going to sound like a broken record. So I would just encourage not to get focused on a particular number. Let's focus on what the hierarchy is. What are the most important things that are having the biggest impact on students? And fund those, and then go beyond that.
Thank you, Jen. Kareem?
Mm-hmm.
So I wasn't aware that we were coming today to have to make some definitive decisions today. So that's where I'm kind of a little, okay, good. I'm glad that I don't hear that, because that concerns me. But we can definitely state we proposed to have a separate day for the ad hoc rather than to have it be for the ad hoc report, rather than to have it be a additional time on an already long board meeting. So I think Ben and President Lindy and I are going to get together to find that time, and we can find that time within the next few weeks. But additionally, we've provided to you all, because we knew that we didn't have time. So I think Phyllis sent it out. You all have some of the preliminary maps to review. And we did, and I asked for that because the ad hoc data is a lot. But one of the things that we're talking about are enrollment numbers that you can look at now, separately from when you get this lengthy report that deals with all of that, it'll be in more context, but you have that data already. All of the board members have it, and I believe it's on board docs.
It is.
So the intention behind that was to give you some relative information around what we're seeing, what we're talking about, and you can put it in context now. So I would ask all of the board members to look at that and then sort of digest it, put it in somewhat of a context, and know that you're going to get written report that outlines that a little bit more. But we are talking about having the ad hoc presentation separately. I don't know if that's going to be a Saturday, but hopefully you all make some time and we will have administration, because we did this ad hoc report in collaboration with administration and the community. So we want the presentation to be the same, and we will have some recommendations as well. And I'm almost certain we will have a large number of people attend, either virtually or online. I mean, in person.
Superintendent, thank you, Kareem.
Last thing from me, if you'll go back to slide 8, Rob, please, just before this one, right there. So I think in terms of movement forward and for information for us, there isn't anything on this big idea list that there is a concern about us doing any information, proposals, deeper study around, and if there's anything that needs to be added to this list, you know, or something immediately that we know that that's not something that we want to look at. If not, that does give us some level of next step direction to start thinking about what we may be able to bring back to the board.
Certainly nothing on my end, and I think as comprehensively and creatively as possible is what's going to be most helpful from my perspective. Any different perspectives?
I don't have a different perspective than that. What I want to make sure we don't do in the interim of whenever the time we next meet and talk about budget, we don't want everybody in the district to start thinking about things that aren't going to be or could be. I don't want, this is so big that it doesn't help to get people's, pardon my language, bowels in an uproar about something before we start really having we have the larger, this has been a great day, and I don't want to ruin it trying to come up in, a couple hours, yes to that, no to that. I think everything's been incredibly useful, and I do sense the urgency. And I know the least amount of money that's going to be cut is going to be $65 million.
Right, exactly.
It's the least
Thank you.
amount of money that's going to be cut.
Right.
And that anything new we propose, something else that falls by the side. Let's just kind of leave it there for a moment and take a breath so that the whole district can kind of engage with us and with you. I mean, I value the fact that you're moving ahead and you have and set us up well today, but it doesn't help for people to get too concerned or too worried in the beginning of this very heavy discussion that's going to go on for a couple of months.
I think we do want to put the administration in a position where they can start to do more research and thinking about these options. Not with we're therefore definitely going to do any of them, but I don't want us to send the signal that they can't do additional research and thinking about this. Yeah, I think they can do that at the same time.
And we clarified that. I mean, that was specific to the district level. We did ask our union partners to look at this because we're live today, to look at the information that we're sharing today. For clarity, we do plan, now that we've done this with the board, to share this same exact information with school leaders on Thursday, so they have the same information that the board has, and they can go back and look at this particular presentation if they so choose to do that. We're not giving schools at this point, for the last bit of clarity, any other numbers. That was only for a conversation to get to the $10 million with the district office. So that was that was very specific to that population.
So we're going to do just real quick, a Brandon and a Mike, and then everybody has in front of you a proposal that I think will be fairly uncontroversial in light of the last 3 hours.
I don't need to talk about
But we're going to do that today because I think it is irresponsible for us as a board not to be proactive about what our priorities are, and be solely reactive. I think is a terrible way to run a school district. So we're going to go to Brandon, we're going to go to Mike, and then we're going to have a quick conversation about this. We're going to get everybody out by 12:30.
I just wanted to make sure, and I think Jen, you asked this question about the timeline, and I do think it is somewhat reasonable for us to say. I think the timeline's a lofty thing to get to with regard, at least to the stuff that's December. I think we, and I don't know if it's something we can push back or if we can have those conversations as far as pushing it back, maybe even just at 1 month, give it a little bit more space. But I think to the point you raised earlier, you've already delayed the magnet school enrollment period. We've done a bunch of stuff to try and prepare as much as possible. And so as much as we could get close to that December timeline to give information out, I think we should try for it. But I think we should also maybe set the reality that we may have to move that date. And that would be the only thing I would say from a board perspective. I think that's more reasonable to say, because I don't want us to be like at December and then that's when we first time say we have to move the date.
Yeah, I would prefer to have that delayed conversation ahead and just plan for it to give you space, because people get frustrated when you set a date and then you break it, right?
Mike, you were going to
so
say?
we're setting up a meeting with
Next week.
next week, okay, and we can have that conversation then.
Mike, you were going to go?
Yeah, and I say this a lot, but I am not above beating horses or jokes or points to death. And so I just think to Eve's point, which is great, and piggybacks off something I think Brandon said earlier, this has been awesome, and I feel as if us 6 are very aligned and appreciative of this. It's felt like a really awesome use of a Saturday morning, afternoon. And I think the strongest thing we can do then, just us 6, I'm not talking to you, I'm done.
Thank you.
Is like then in the interim that when people come up and start throwing out things like 15% of this, they'd be like, look, I love the line, Ben brought it up, that it's going to be huge. There's going to be a ton. I love what Eve just said, 65 million, bare minimum. Bear with us. We're putting kids first. We're going to go from there. Administration's on it. We trust them. If it's all the same, can we just get onto something else? Like I literally last week ended a conversation with somebody that way. About the district, and they were fine with it. I mean, I didn't like big time or nothing. I said, and that's all I'm going to say about it. And they're like, people respond to that pretty well. Actually, they're like, okay, well, I guess I'm done with that. But that's, I think, the strongest thing we can do, right? Is just like, and then we can fight about the recommendations later on. But
okay,
for now,
so
yeah.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, everybody. Can we take a quick second to just look, Jen? I don't want to cut you off. I also really want to make sure we have time to do the last piece of the agenda. Is yours quick?
Yeah, I just failed to mention that we've worked with superintendent's team to create a budget website that's dedicated solely to very transparently keep everybody informed. So anything that we do, any process, any formulas, any information related to the budget building will be on that website when it goes live.
Thank you. Rob, can you make that just a truck ton bigger? Thank you. Okay, so we have not had real new priorities in quite some time. I actually think there's not a lot, from my perspective, not a lot of division around here. I wrote these up earlier and was just surprised at how aligned they were with our conversation today. We do, from my perspective, and in looking back on what people said on our September 11th meeting when we talked about this last, people mentioned things like progress monitoring, goals and guardrails, transportation, the superintendent eval. I think all those can fit nicely under a category of accountability. And that's an important function for our board. There's no question, I think, in anybody's mind that this budget process is one of the most important things that we're going to be doing in the last 2 months of the year. This is really just 2 months now, because we'll have an election, we'll have a new board, we'll have new leadership, look again in January. And then the last one has also come up today on reviewing and deciding on ad hoc recommendations, because we really can't do the other two well without doing that. And so my hope is that this is a relatively uncontroversial kind of no-duh kind of proposal. And I really did make an effort to incorporate the things people shared in our November 11th meeting. But I wanted to check, while we're in a public session with a majority of board members, anybody have a concern if we make these our 3, and by this I mean like we should be spending most of our time in our board meetings and executive sessions focused on these three things. Not 100%, but like most of it. Okay, well, that'd be fine. But like, I just, that we're spending our time on purpose, not reacting to things that are happening around us. Any concerns? Awesome. We should have just done this way a long time ago. Okay, so if there are no other concerns, we can end 9 minutes early and send people home for their weekend, or is there anything else that people would like to do? Having no other business before us, I declare our meeting adjourned. Thank you.
Good to be back.